Hey everyone, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy the audiobooks, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support us further, consider becoming a Patreon member. As a member, you'll gain the ability to request the next part of a novel audiobook I've uploaded, depending on your Patreon tier.
Throughout the night, Elijah kept adding fuel to the fire, so by the time morning came, he was still tired, and his meager store of firewood had been vastly depleted. But he'd managed to keep it going, so there was a chance that he wouldn't have to go through the grueling process of creating a friction fire again. Of course, he'd have to make sure it had plenty of fuel while he went about the tasks he had planned for the day, but that was unavoidable. There was a reason most survivalists never left home without a ferro rod, after all. Starting and maintaining a fire was hard but ultimately necessary work. Elijah was only thankful that he had plenty of experience with it. Otherwise, he'd have a lot of cold nights ahead of him, and his chances of survival would have plummeted. Either way, the moment the night turned to dawn, Elijah was up and stretching. He was sore from the previous day's exertions, but not nearly as much as he might have expected. He almost felt like he had before his body had been ravaged by cancer, radiation, and chemotherapy. He still wasn't quite there, but that bone-deep weakness that, for months, had been his constant companion had disappeared. As he stretched, he went over his tasks for the day. His first goal was to refresh his store of firewood. It wouldn't be easy because he could only really gather fallen limbs and sticks, and most of those had been rotted by the constant humidity and frequent rainfall. However, it was all he could do until he could create some tools. He had some plans for how to do that, but he knew it would all be trial and error. He had no experience with that kind of thing, so he knew it would probably lean more toward the latter. He could figure it out. If cavemen could do it, then he could too. But that wasn't a short-term task. For now, he needed to focus on immediate survival. So, after getting loose, Elijah set out from the cabin and started gathering fallen branches and sticks. Like that, he spent most of his morning until, finally, he had accumulated a sizable pile inside his cabin. Most of the wood was wet, but he hoped that the protection of the cabin's roof would give everything a chance to dry out. After feeding a bit more wood into the fire, Elijah went searching for another walking stick. Or staff, given that he intended to use it in his upcoming crab hunting expedition. It took another couple of hours, but he eventually stumbled upon a birch tree whose limbs would make for a fine staff. He only had to get to them first. The few that had fallen to the ground were long since rotted, so he had no choice but to climb a few feet up the trunk and somehow cut a limb loose. He even saw a likely target that wasn't that far out of reach. Fortunately, the tree itself wasn't that big around, and with his newly recovered strength and endurance, Elijah found it fairly easy to climb. Then, once he reached the limb, he wrapped his legs around the trunk and got to work. With his hands free, Elijah placed the rusted knife's edge on the branch, then used a rock he'd recently gathered to hammer out a cut. With his legs burning from the exertion, he continued at it until he'd made a sizable notch that dug a quarter of the way through the branch. If he wanted to make it all the way through, he'd be up there for hours, and he knew his energy reserves wouldn't last that long. So, without much other choice, he took a deep breath, then reached out to the branch with both hands. Finally, he let go with his legs and swung free. The branch held for a split second before a loud crack filled the air. Then, Elijah fell a dozen feet to land on the leaf-strewn ground. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, and he felt something in his ankle twist, but he'd accomplished his goal. In normal circumstances, it would have been stupid to do such a thing. The chances of injury, which were obviously well-founded, judging by the throbbing in his ankle and what he suspected were a couple of broken ribs, were too high. However, Elijah had a healing spell in his pocket, and because of that, he'd already decided that he could be a bit reckless with his body. So long as he didn't incapacitate himself by hitting his head or something, he felt confident that he could heal himself from whatever injuries he might sustain. Still, there was the pain to worry about, but it was a small price to pay, given that something like the staff would improve his chances of survival. But it was easy to make that kind of judgment before he actually had to endure it. Now that he felt the consequences of his actions, he'd begun to question whether or not he was an idiot. Even so, what was done, and he had more than enough experience dealing with pain and discomfort. Not only had he spent quite a lot of time in the boxing gym, and all that entailed, but he'd also been through the horror that was cancer and chemotherapy. He could handle the pain of a twisted ankle long enough to heal it. Still lying there, Elijah looked inward and grabbed the Ethera in his core, dragging it into the pathways of his soul. Once he was flooded with the magical energy, he embraced his lone spell. He placed his hand, which glowed with verdant Ethera, on his side and used his spell to heal the broken bones. The first application didn't do the trick, but the second pushed the pain into the background. A third, which exhausted the Ethera in his core, finished the job, letting him breathe freely. Sighing, Elijah sat up and inspected his ankle. "That's definitely not a sprain," he muttered through gritted teeth. In the time it had taken him to heal his ribs, which was no more than a couple of minutes, the ankle had already started to turn purple. It was also swollen to twice its normal size. Perhaps it was broken as well. That really brought home the stupidity of his actions. Just because he could heal himself didn't mean that he was invincible. While it would doubtless help, he had a limited amount of Ethera at his disposal, and regenerating it took time. Time he could have spent trying to accomplish the hundreds of other tasks he needed to button up before he felt his survival would be assured. Lying back, he let out another deep breath. Magic was helpful, but it wasn't the cure-all he hoped it would be. Elijah let out a little chuckle. He'd only been using magic for a day or so, and already, it felt mundane. It was just another tool in his tool belt, not a miracle that would solve all his problems. Perhaps in the future, it would be more impactful, but for now, it was too limited to do much more than heal small injuries. As he lay there waiting for his Ethera to regenerate, Elijah's mind wandered. And then, suddenly, the feeling that something was watching him returned. It was buried within that pervasive sensation of belonging that had come courtesy of his Druid archetype, but it was there, all the same. Slowly, he turned his head in the direction he thought it was coming from, and he saw a brief flash of movement in a nearby clump of trees. Then it was gone. The feeling, whatever was stalking him, everything, only his one with nature remained. Clearly, he wasn't alone in the forest. That wasn't really a surprise, but he'd hoped that he could avoid any major predators. There was a chance that whatever had been following him was just a curious herbivore, but he felt almost certain that that wasn't the case. After all, a simple deer wouldn't have sent a chill up Elijah's spine. Probably. It was just further evidence that he needed to curtail his risky behavior. If something attacked him while he was injured, he wouldn't last long. For the next few minutes, Elijah kept his inner eye on his core while his physical eyes scanned the area. But nothing came, and, eventually, he was able to heal his ankle. It took 4 uses of Touch of Nature, which told him that the injury was much worse than he'd first suspected. Stupid, he muttered to himself as he climbed to his feet. He inspected the branch he'd risked everything for. It was long, probably 10 feet straight, and about 2 inches thick. A little bigger than Elijah preferred, but he hoped to whittle that down. Eventually. For now, though, it was a good stick. Using the same method he'd used to notch the branch before taking it down, Elijah arduously undertook the task of bringing it down to size. It took a while, most of which was spent banging the rock into the knife blade, but he managed to cut a roughly 5-foot section. He also carved one end into a rough point. For what he planned, it needed to act as both a spear and a staff, but it couldn't be too delicate. He dragged the rest back to his cabin, where he intended to cut it into firewood. Waste not, want not, he thought, tossing the unused portion into the corner. He'd get to that later. For now, hunger gnawed at his belly, and he wanted to use his staff for its intended purpose. So, after popping a few bunchberries into his mouth and taking a quick trip to the stream, where he washed his face and drank his fill of water, Elijah slowly made his way back to the beach. There, the crabs waited, looking entirely disoriented. It wasn't a surprise. Purple shore crabs usually lived under rocks, and their diets consisted mostly of algae and the rare small animal. So, suddenly being the size of a mid-sized dog was understandably disorienting to the creatures. As a result, they milled around, their instincts telling them to find a rock to hide under while their size prohibited any such action. In a way, it was sad. Or it would have been if Elijah hadn't recently woken up to a herd of them desperately trying to eat his legs. No, not trying. Succeeding. He'd had the wounds to show for it too. Clutching his stick, Elijah knelt down as he studied his intended prey. The monstrous crustaceans were big enough that they were a threat, but their disorientation meant that they had yet to adjust to their new size. If they had, the things could end up being a real terror, especially if they were capable of traveling inland. Elijah could easily imagine a scenario where a horde of giant crabs swept through the area, devouring everything they found, including him and his cabin. But he couldn't worry about that right now. He wasn't there to call the population. Instead, he just wanted some meat. So, he watched and waited until one of the crabs separated itself from the others. It skittered down the shore, which was comprised mostly of slippery, wet rocks. The crab was completely ignorant of how it had made itself into attractive prey. Elijah felt something ignite in his mind. When he was younger, he'd spent quite a lot of time hunting and fishing with his father. Those were some of his fondest memories. But back then, he'd never felt so focused as he did at that moment. It was like the spirit of a great predator flowed through him. He stalked forward on bare, silent feet. Holding the staff in both hands like a spear, he followed the crab until it was almost 40 yards away from the rest of the group. But still, it wandered, stopping ever so often to nip at some bit of kelp. Any other time, Elijah might have remembered how many nutrients he could get from seaweed, but in this instance, his mind was laser-focused. One step after another, he moved forward, steadily gaining on the brownish-purple crab. His progress was slow, but that was intentional. He didn't need to go quickly. He just needed to do it right. Finally, when he was only feet away, he pounced, swinging his staff at the comparatively delicate backmost leg. His first strike connected with a solid crunch, but the crab whipped around without any hesitation, nearly latching onto Elijah with its enormous front claw. He dashed to the side, narrowly avoiding the skittering creature, but it scuttled after him. He ran, quickly outpacing the oversized crustacean. When he was 20 feet away, Elijah looked back to see that the crab had lost interest. Apparently, even if it had grown quite a bit, it hadn't gotten any smarter. So, Elijah circled back around until he was once again behind the crab, then stalked forward and repeated the process. This time, he put a little less force into the blow so he could maintain control and avoid the creature's response. Once again, his sturdy stick hit with a solid crack, and he darted away. The crab's pursuit came much more slowly this time. Elijah's hit-and-run tactics continued until, at last, all of its legs were broken, rendering it almost completely immobile. Still, it wasn't dead. In fact, judging by its barely audible hisses and whistling screeches, it was in quite a lot of pain. It was a cruel way to kill something, but without proper tools, there was nothing more Elijah could do. But he didn't have to prolong the kill. So, he carefully approached its rear once again, and using his stick as a lever, flipped the crab over onto its back. It tried to snap at him, but Elijah had expected that, so he was already backing away and circling back around to the rear. Once there, he approached the helpless creature, located the proper position, and used his staff like a spear. It took a handful of strikes to get through even its softer underbelly, but eventually he pierced through the shell and severed the nerve center closest to its head. Then he repeated the process on the one near its rear, killing it. Throughout the whole process, the crab snapped its claws ineffectually, but so long as he was careful, Elijah didn't have to worry about that. Still, what he had done was an incredibly inhumane way to kill something. But given his lack of equipment, there was no other way to do it. Sighing, he looked down at the crab's corpse. He wasn't looking forward to processing it, but he knew that it would only be a matter of time before the other crabs sensed the presence of food. So, taking out his rusty knife, Elijah bent down and got to work. Elijah studied the results of his efforts, which had been arranged into separate piles according to their intended purpose. The first was simple enough. It was comprised of a couple of crab claws, each the size of a small animal. Beneath that chitinous exterior was at least a few pounds of white meat, which Elijah hoped would see him through until he could supplement his diet with fish. He'd considered harvesting the rest of the crab, but he'd run into two problems. First, crab had a tendency to turn rancid very quickly, and he had no way to preserve the meat. Even the amount he could get from the claws was pushing it, and he wouldn't dare eat it after 24 hours. Even with his ability to heal himself, he wasn't interested in getting food poisoning from bad crab meat. Second, the other crabs had eventually noticed the smell of nearby carrion, and like the opportunistic scavengers they were, had quickly come scuttling in Elijah's direction. So, even though he'd only managed to break off the creature's claws and legs, he wasn't able to do much else without drawing the ire of the oversized crustaceans. But he wasn't too upset. The crabs didn't seem like they were going anywhere, and he already had proof that he could efficiently hunt them. If his other plans for food failed, he felt confident that he could always get more crab. In the future, as the weather turned colder, perhaps he could even use it to bolster his stores of food for the winter. That wasn't one of his immediate concerns, though. The next pile held various bits and pieces of the crab's shell that Elijah intended to fashion into needles and hooks. It would take some doing, but he was nothing if not adaptable. Plenty of ancient people had used bones for hooks, and while crab shell was a lot more brittle, it made up for its unsuitability by being readily available. With as much chitin as he had harvested, Elijah was sure that he could make it work. After harvesting the crab, Elijah had been forced to flee the shore and head back to the cabin, where he'd piled his treasure trove of food and potential building material. Then he got to work. The first thing he did was pop open one of the shells by cracking it with a few blows from his walking stick. Normal crab claws weren't that difficult to crack, but Elijah soon found that these purple shore crabs hadn't just gained size. They'd gained durability as well, and even in death, its shell made for an extremely tough material. He couldn't help but wonder if he should be saving it for some sort of armor. After all, he'd already discovered that the wilderness was dangerous. Having some protection wouldn't go amiss. But he tabled that thought in favor of focusing on his task, and eventually, his efforts bore fruit in the form of a cracked claw. Once its structure had been compromised, it was much easier to get to the meat within. Elijah picked the shards of the shell away, then carefully gathered the white meat. It seemed tougher than most crab meat he'd encountered, but as far as he could tell, it seemed edible. So, he tossed the meat into his pot. The second claw he left alone for the time being. For now, it would keep better inside the shell, at least until morning when he intended to eat it for breakfast. Once Elijah had a pot full of crab meat, he set it over his small fire and waited on it to cook, stirring it ever so often with his small knife. To be sure it was completely done, Elijah overcooked it by quite a bit, but that was because he knew the dangers of eating undercooked crab. Just because he had the ability to heal himself didn't mean he wanted to tempt fate. Besides, he had a couple of plans for his Ethera, and healing himself because he ate the wrong things didn't factor into them. Eating the crab was not a pleasurable experience. Certainly, it would provide him with the necessary proteins and fat that mushrooms and berries couldn't give him, but he lacked the tools to prepare it properly. As a result, it alternated between mushy, salty, and burned. Elijah had to keep reminding himself that it was necessary in order to keep himself going. Once he'd choked down his meal, he headed back to the stream to wash his pot and rinse the taste out of his mouth. Along the way, he stumbled upon some more berries, which he quickly gathered and ate. Just before he reached the stream, Elijah felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Something was watching him. He knew it the same way he'd felt the tree. Whether it was his connection to nature or something more concrete, Elijah had no idea. But he didn't dare ignore it. Slowly, he turned a circle as he searched for whatever had followed him. As he did so, his mind ran amok, conjuring images of mutated versions of all the predators native to the region. Bears, cougars, wolves, and coyotes were at the top of the list, but there were plenty of other, smaller creatures that could pose a danger, especially if they'd grown the same way the crabs had. Suddenly, he thought of a man-sized mosquito, and he nearly started running right then and there. But he stopped himself, even if he couldn't keep his heart from beating out of his chest. He could only hope that the system hadn't chosen that route. For a long few minutes, Elijah continued to study his surroundings, but he was no more successful in finding his stalker. Then, the feeling of foreboding disappeared, leaving him sweating profusely as his heart hammered in his chest. For another 5 minutes, Elijah didn't dare move. Then, finally, he managed to steady his breathing and refocus his mind. Whatever had been there, and he was sure it was something, had chosen not to attack. And if he wanted to survive, he couldn't afford to let fear dictate his actions. Of course, it was one thing to think that and another to overcome the sense of palpable terror he'd felt. Even the remnants were potent enough to keep him rooted in place. But slowly, Elijah managed to shake it off and continue along toward the stream. By the time he'd reached it and started cleaning his pot, he had convinced himself that it was all just an overreaction to an overactive imagination. Mostly. But in the back of his mind, he knew it was real. The fact that he'd felt it multiple times since washing ashore was as much an indicator as the visceral feeling of being watched. However, the more time that passed, the easier it was to push that certainty aside in favor of the necessities of survival. Once Elijah finished washing up, he trekked back to the cabin. The moment he entered the area, though, he realized that something was wrong. He crouched, holding his walking stick in one hand and the pot in the other. Neither were great weapons, but he wasn't exactly spoiled for choice. The forest was deathly silent as he crept toward the derelict cabin. No birds sang. No squirrels chirped. Even the insects seemed to have gone dormant. Flattening himself against the cabin's most intact wall, he slid forward, inch by inch, until he could see the interior. It was completely unoccupied. His fire still burned, low but merry in the waning light of approaching evening. But it all felt wrong. Like the space had been violated. It took Elijah's conscious mind a moment to catch up, but when he did, he let out an audible curse. The remaining crab claw was gone, and in its place were a couple of faint tracks. Elijah slowly moved into the cabin and investigated the site of the theft, and he was unsurprised to see feline paw prints in the soft earth. And they were huge, far bigger than he would have expected from a mountain lion or a bobcat, which were the only big cats native to the area. But that didn't really mean anything, did it? The crabs had grown. Why couldn't a bobcat? Or worse, a cougar? In the back of his mind, though, Elijah considered another option. The tree that had guided him through his cultivation had clearly come from somewhere else. It wasn't a native to Earth. So, it stood to reason that the system had brought new dangers to the area. Obviously, Elijah couldn't be certain. He didn't have enough information. But he also couldn't discount the possibility that the region was now home to a super predator like a tiger or a lion. Fear gripped him, cold and palpable. He knew he wouldn't stand a chance against something like that. Especially not with only a stick and a pot to defend himself. Sure, if he was wounded, he could use touch of nature to heal himself, but that seemed a poor substitute for combat ability. That's when Elijah decided to implement his budding plan for self-improvement. He had woeful attributes, especially in strength. His body of wood had helped with that, but it was clear that if he wanted to survive, he needed to address his weaknesses. The most straightforward way to do so was to go out and kill things. He'd felt a bit of foreign Ethera enter his body when he'd killed the crab, and he'd intuited that it was something akin to experience from a video game. But it wasn't much, and he sensed that he'd have to kill quite a few more if he wanted to progress in that manner. The tree had also explained that he could gain levels via other actions associated with his archetype, but he hadn't felt any influx of Ethera when he'd healed himself. So, that ruled out a plan for intentionally injuring himself and reaping the Ethera from healing the wounds. If he was honest, Elijah was glad for that. That kind of path, even if it had proven effective, would have been too disturbing. So, that left him with one other possibility. He could do things the old-fashioned way. Elijah was no stranger to working out, so he knew that, so long as he had fuel for his body, he could slowly strengthen himself. In addition, he could cut down his recovery times significantly by using touch of nature to heal himself. He had no idea how soon he could expect gains, but he suspected that it would be fairly quick. In the meantime, he would continue to survive. Thankfully, the native predator hadn't disturbed Elijah's pile of chitin, so he could still enact his plan to create hooks and needles. Once he had those, he could make some rudimentary fishing line from some dogbane he'd seen in the tree's meadow. It wouldn't be nearly as strong as synthetic fishing line, but it would still be better than trying to unravel the threads of his remaining clothing. Elijah settled down close to the fire and went to work. Normally, he'd have carved the hooks from wood, but the crab's chitinous exoskeleton was too appropriate to pass up. From a mundane crab, the shell would have likely been too brittle, but for this evolved version, it almost had the texture and strength of plastic. Besides, there had been some spines on the underside of the legs that were nearly perfect for hooks. All it took was for Elijah to separate them, then whittle them down to size, a tedious process that took time and concentration, but little actual skill. Eventually, he managed to create his first hook. He held it close to the campfire's light and grinned. It wasn't ideal, not like a metal hook would have been, but it wasn't bad either. By that point, night had truly fallen, but Elijah wanted to get a few more hooks made before he went to sleep. In the end, he only got 3 finished, but he was happy with them all. So, having accomplished his goal, he curled up in his corner of the cabin and went to sleep. The next morning, Elijah awoke feeling somewhat refreshed. He wasn't certain if it was the effect of having a filling meal, or if his body was just getting stronger, but he felt better than he had since before his diagnosis. Which was good, because he had a lot of plans for the day. The first few hours he spent doing various calisthenics and lifting some heavy rocks he'd found near the shore. And if he hadn't believed his status before, he was soon convinced by his weakness. Still, he sensed that his body was stronger and more durable than it should be, likely due to his cultivation. He intended to exploit that, pushing himself far past the point of exhaustion with each exercise. After a few hours, he spent a while resting and healing himself with touch of nature, and he was surprised to see that his status reflected his work. His strength had risen by a single point. If he could continue along that track, he could truly make some gains. Once he felt up to it, he set out toward the meadow where he'd seen the dogbane. When he got there, he noticed that the tree was still dormant. However, it still radiated a sense of calm power, letting him know that it was no normal tree. Not that he would have made that mistake, anyway. One look was all it took to put the lie to any notion of normality. But he wasn't there to gape at the tree. Instead, he gathered an armful of dogbane, which were red-stalked weeds that, when picked apart, could make for decent cordage. Having accomplished that, he headed back to his cabin, where he intended to start the process of making fishing line. The trip was uneventful, save for Elijah stopping from time to time to pick various berries or edible fungi. He even found some rose hips, which was a nice discovery. More importantly, he wasn't beset by that same fear he'd felt near the stream, which was enough to put his mind at ease. Finally, he reached the cabin and relaxed. It remained completely undisturbed, which was reassuring after the previous intrusion. Elijah could only hope that his good luck would continue long enough for him to ensure his survival. Alyssa stood on the roof of the police station and gazed out across the parking lot. There, she saw a haggard group of people waiting in front of the crude brick wall Carmen had built. It was rough, but at almost 6 feet high and half as thick, it had proven to be very effective in the weeks since it had been built. "What do you think?" asked Roman, who'd taken a position beside her. She glanced his way. The past couple of months had been difficult for everyone, but Roman had been hit particularly hard by all the death they'd seen. After that first night in the police station, they'd set about creating a safe haven, and along the way, they'd picked up quite a few survivors. At present, their little community, which had extended well past the station by virtue of a series of hastily built structures behind the main building, numbered in the hundreds. And more seemed to come every day. "I don't know," she said. "Same as always, right? Take them in, interview them, and then watch them closely." "That method doesn't work," he said, clearly referring to a recent incident where a few recent additions had plundered the stores of supplies. The group had escaped before anyone even knew they'd stolen anything. Where they'd gone, no one knew, but Roman wanted to hunt them down. Everyone else had talked him out of it. "What's the alternative?" Alyssa asked. "Martial law," he said. "Curfews. Strict rationing. Rewards for good behavior." "You make it sound like a prison," she said. He'd spent the first part of his career working at the local jail, so the fact that he'd gone down that road wasn't terribly surprising. "Same concepts. And you think that's fair?" she asked. "Fair has nothing to do with it," he answered. "Look around, Alyssa. This isn't a world where we get to worry about personal freedom. We all have to work toward the greater good, or we won't survive. You know that as well as anyone else." Indeed, she'd seen more death in the past 2 months than she'd ever thought possible. The first few days had been particularly hard on the local townspeople, and it was only through luck that their little group had managed to survive. She'd heard stories about monsters breaking into houses within a few hours of the world's integration, and what's more, she'd seen the results for herself. The reality was that they had suddenly found themselves in an incredibly dangerous world where support was a distant concept. They had no choice but to take care of themselves. But that need had brought to light an additional problem, They all had different ideas about how to go about it. Roman leaned toward a strict policy where everyone was expected to pull their weight, and if they didn't, they'd be left behind. Understandable, considering what was at stake. By contrast, Alyssa wanted to leave people to their own devices, at least for the most part. Sure, she expected people to work for the greater good, but she had no interest in forcing them to do things against their will. And she would never kick anyone out of the compound they'd established. Roman would, and without even a hint of guilt. If someone wasn't pulling their weight, they were worthless to him. Again, Alyssa didn't exactly disagree with that assertion. She knew how close they were to tipping over the edge. But she didn't think someone deserved to die just because they were incapable, for whatever reason, of working toward the greater good. Some lacked the skills. Others were barely functional after losing friends and family. Only a few refused for selfish reasons. "I think we need to go down and let them in," Alyssa said. "We're going to have to figure this out eventually," Roman stated. "We need a system. We're getting too big to be on the honor system." Alyssa nodded. "Then we get everyone together and hash it out," she said. "Or we tell people how it's going to be, and if they don't like it, they can leave," he responded. "We can't do that." He sighed. They'd had the discussion more than a few times, and he clearly didn't want to revisit the debate. So, he said, "We'll figure it out later, then. For now, we need to get those people inside." With that, the pair descended from the roof via a ladder that led to the ground. Then they headed toward the gate. Like the wall Carmen had constructed, it was a crude thing made of plywood and rebar they'd found at a construction site just outside of town, but it did the job well enough. They pulled it open. "Oh, thank God," said a shabby-looking fellow armed with a shovel. He sported a few wounds, as did the rest of his party. There were 7 in all, 2 of which were women, each looking like they'd been through hell. "We heard there were people here, but I wasn't sure what we would find." "Where did you hear that?" demanded Roman. Around? I don't know, we ran into a group a few days back," the man said, running his hand through greasy hair. "They told us about this compound. Said it was safe." "Nowhere is safe," Alyssa stated. "All right," he said, glancing at Roman. The former police chief held his bow at the ready, and he already had an arrow nocked. He hadn't gone so far as to draw it back, but the threat was clear in his expression. The refugee asked, Can we come in? We've been walking for 2 days and—" "What are your archetypes?" Roman asked. "What? Archetypes? What are we dealing with here?" Roman repeated. "I'm a ranger. Martha is a mage. 2 warriors. 2 scholars. And a tradesman." "No healers?" asked Alyssa in obvious disappointment. "And 2 scholars?" "Useless," Roman added. One of the women spoke up. "We're not useless. I'm a historian and I think nobody cares what you used to be. Or didn't you get the memo? The world ended 2 months ago. Now, all that matters is if you're useful," Roman said. "That means fighting, gathering, healing, building things. Can you do any of that? Then you're useless. But that's fine. We need manual laborers too." One of the men said, "But I have a doctorate. I can—" "In what?" "French literature." "Useless." Alyssa wanted to speak up, but they'd agreed to present a unified front. She didn't like how dismissive Roman was, but division was even worse. So she held her tongue. Meanwhile, Roman told the group of refugees the rules. They weren't onerous. No fighting. No stealing. Everyone worked toward collective survival, and if they were attacked, which wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of either, everyone was required to contribute to the defense in one way or another. "Food is earned," he went on. "You work, you eat. You don't work, you starve. You refuse to contribute, you can take your ass elsewhere. We've got no use for freeloaders." "We'll work," the leader said. "Damn right you will," Roman stated. Then, his expression softened and he extended his hand. "Roman Kane. This is Alyssa Hart." "Kane? That sounds familiar," said the man. "Used to be the police chief," Roman said. "Before everything went to shit, I mean. Not much use for those kinds of titles these days, though." It was at that moment that Alyssa saw a flicker of movement as something streaked toward the open gate. She couldn't see what it was, but she had been in enough fights in the past couple of months that she didn't hesitate to act. Yanking the machete from the sheath at her waist, She used charge and dashed forward to meet it. As she did, she used her newest ability, which she had acquired upon reaching level 3. Stomping on the ground, she let loose with shockwave, sending an invisible pulse of force to hit the monster. It didn't do much, just stunning it for a split second, but it was enough to give Alyssa an opening. She used it, slashing down with all the force she could muster. And considering that she'd put all her free points into her physical attributes, the power she could bring to bear was considerable. The creature, which looked like some kind of monstrous weasel, took the blade on the shoulder. The momentum of the overhand attack knocked it into the ground. And a moment later, an arrow took it in the eye, killing it instantly. Alyssa's charge dissipated, and she slowed to a stop. Her eyes darted back and forth. Sometimes, the monsters moved in packs, and she wanted to ensure that the weasel had been alone. She saw nothing, suggesting that it was a lone hunter. Then, once she'd ensured that there were no other threats, she reached down and grabbed the monster by the tail. In one swift motion, she hefted it and slung it over one shoulder before turning to the stunned refugees. "Good fur. Winter's coming, and we're going to need all the materials we can get," she said. Indeed, the monster was almost 4 feet long, which meant that its pelt would make for a decent blanket. They had access to quite a bit of cloth, by virtue of looting the abandoned homes and the handful of businesses in the town proper, but no one could afford to turn down any resources. "Come on in," said Roman. "We'll get you settled." With that, the stunned group came through. Alyssa sheathed her machete, then dragged the gate closed, locking it in place. Then, she told Roman, "I'll go drop this for Carmen. She can probably make something with it." He nodded, and as he led the group into the main building, Alyssa circled around to the left. Soon, she caught sight of Carmen, who was wearing nothing but a sports bra, a pair of shorts, and a heavy leather apron. The other woman was busy stoking a forge. Alyssa took a moment to admire her wife's muscular form before she remembered that she had a dead animal over her shoulder. Once she did, she strode forward, and when she reached the smithy, deposited the animal carcass. "Really?" Carmen said, cutting her eyes at the corpse. "Right in the middle of my smithy?" Alyssa shrugged. "Don't know where else to stick it," she said. "You want me to process it? Go nuts." Alyssa did just that, pulling a knife from where it was strapped to her thigh. Then she commenced with gutting, skinning, and quartering the animal. It took a while, and when she'd finished, her arms were covered in blood up to her elbows. But it was worthwhile, and not just because of the pelt. The meat looked perfectly edible, which would come in handy considering the shortage of food. "I have no idea how you can do that," Carmen said, handing Alyssa a bucket of water. "Just watching you makes me want to vomit. Grew up hunting with my dad," she said with a shrug as she washed the blood off. "New arrivals have any decent skills?" "Not sure. There was a ranger, so maybe he can help with defense and hunting," she said. "The mage. A couple of warriors. And a tradesman. 2 scholars, unfortunately." Alyssa didn't precisely agree with Roman about what to do with the less useful people in their budding community, but she couldn't deny that she was more than a little disappointed with the scholars. "Oh, maybe I can get an apprentice," said Carmen. Alyssa shrugged. "Maybe," she agreed. "What are you working on anyway?" "Boar spear," Carmen stated. "I think I've got the blade shaped. I just need to get it sharpened and attached to the haft." "Nice," Alyssa said. She could see the use of such a weapon. Many of the monsters they fought were just mutated animals who just charged blindly when they were disturbed. For that kind of situation, you couldn't get much better than a boar spear. "Glad you approve, because I made it for you," she said. "Someone else might. Didn't make it for anyone else. I don't give 2 shits about all those other people. All I care about is that you and Miggy stay alive. That's why I made it," Carmen said. Alyssa sighed, then rolled her eyes. "So noble." "I'll leave the nobility to you," Carmen said. "Whatever. You going to be here much longer?" she asked. "A few more hours," Carmen said, glancing at the sky. Night was still quite a ways off. "But save some of that weasel, yeah? Miggy hasn't been getting enough meat?" "Will do," Alyssa responded. That was one thing they definitely agreed on. No matter what else happened, the boy was their first priority. She leaned in and kissed Carmen, then said, "Don't work yourself to death." And then she headed back toward the main building. There was still a lot to do, after all. Elijah hacked at the block of wood, careful to hit it just right. Over the last couple of months, he'd had plenty of practice, but even so, losing concentration would be disastrous for the results. He spared a glance for the pile of firewood propped against one corner of his shelter and reconsidered that word. Disastrous. For weeks after washing ashore, every action had been one of life and death. When he'd killed his first crab, when he'd made his first tools, and, finally, when he'd caught his first fish, the stakes had been incredibly high. But now, he had a stock of smoked fish, a hoard of berries, and a store of mushrooms. Food wouldn't be an issue anytime soon. In fact, he felt confident that his cache would last him through most of the winter, and if he continued to gather food, he wouldn't even need to ration. He looked down at his crude axe. The blade was made of chipped flint, sharpened and refined over the course of a week. It wasn't his first such tool. They had a habit of cracking if he used them too roughly, and he was certain it wouldn't be his last. The same went for his stone knife and spear, the latter of which had yet to even see use. Regardless, he could always make more. He'd found a nice vein of the stuff in a nearby cliff, so he wouldn't soon lack for material. Elijah sighed, flexing his shoulders. Over the past 6 weeks, he'd made incredible progress regarding his overall physical condition. Some of that was due to his usage of touch of nature that reduced his recovery times to mere minutes, rather than days. But he also felt confident that his body of wood had played a part as well. When he turned his mind inward, Elijah got the feeling that his body wanted, or needed, perhaps, to be stronger. Whatever the case, the result was explosive muscle growth that had left him nearly as strong as he'd been before his cancer diagnosis. It was a good thing, too, because there was no way his weakened body could have survived for more than a couple of weeks. Getting stronger and healthier hadn't been a mere desire, it had been a necessity for survival. And Elijah had thrown himself into it accordingly. The results spoke for themselves. Elijah didn't have access to a mirror, but from what he could see of his arms, legs, and torso, his entire body was lean and corded with compact muscle. He'd never looked like a bodybuilder. Wilderness survival didn't lend itself to packing en masse. But he did look, and more importantly, feel healthier than he had in recent memory. More importantly, Elijah's constant fishing and crab hunting had had another side effect. Each kill had netted him an accumulation of foreign Ethera. With the fish, it was barely noticeable. A thimbleful compared to the crab's cup. But he'd killed a lot of fish, and the pool of Ethera had slowly grown until Elijah felt as if he was going to burst. Soon, maybe the next time he went fishing, he was certain that he would gain a level. And with that, according to one of the notifications he'd seen after having the Druid archetype thrust upon him, he'd get another 2 points to improve his stats. He couldn't wait because he already knew where those points were going to go. First, though, he needed to finish his daily chores, chopping firewood and gathering water, before he could go fishing. An unrelated shiver ran up his spine. In the past, he would have panicked. But over the weeks, he'd grown used to his stalker. If it really wanted to kill him, it would have done so already. With each passing day, Elijah had grown stronger and gotten better equipped. His axe and spear weren't ideal weapons, and he was certain that they wouldn't give him the edge he needed to survive an encounter with the still unseen feline predator. However, he was confident that he could at least wound it. Perhaps the creature knew that as well. Or maybe he was just anthropomorphizing it by attributing human intelligence and reasoning ability to an animal. Either way, if the cat, and he was fairly certain that's what it was, wanted to kill him, it had already had plenty of opportunities to do so, and with less risk than he now presented. Besides, he had an agreement with the creature. Sort of. Slipping his axe's haft through his belt of twined dogbane fibers, Elijah grabbed the fruit of his day's labor and piled it into a neat stack inside his shelter. The cabin had undergone almost as drastic a transformation as his body, and he'd used a series of logs from trees he'd cut down, branches, and moss to enclose the space. At the time, it hadn't been wholly necessary, but with every passing week, he drew closer to winter. That, in turn, meant that he needed a much sturdier home to stave off the incoming weather. It also served as rudimentary protection from any wildlife that might come sniffing around. It had been the work of a rough couple of weeks, but he'd finally gotten it to a passable, if not completely comfortable, state. With his firewood put away, Elijah sat on the stump he'd dragged inside the shelter and let out a sigh. For a moment, he just sat there, gathering his thoughts. That was one of the issues with living a solitary life. Often, he'd lose himself in his inner thoughts, and he wouldn't even realize that he'd been staring off into space for some indeterminate amount of time. Usually, his thoughts weren't elaborate. Instead, they were mostly comprised of half-forgotten memories from the distant past. Ultimately, that was a good thing. He'd had a good childhood with loving parents who would have done anything they could to support him. Certainly, they'd passed away before their time, which was anything but pleasant, but he'd long chosen to focus on the good times they'd shared rather than the devastating loss of their passing. So, as he sat there, he found his mind drifting back to when his father had taught him the rudiments of boxing, to when his mother would take him out into the woods where she helped him to identify various wild edibles. Or when the entire family would visit the farmer's market. Little things, all, but they were enough to keep his spirits up. Idly, he found himself wondering how his sister was coping. What was life like in the cities? She didn't live within Seattle's city limits, but it was close enough that she wouldn't have escaped the problems that came with the metropolitan area. The world had irrevocably changed. There was magic now. If what had happened to the plane was any indication, modern technology had probably failed. He'd lost his phone in the crash, but he suspected that even if it had survived, it would have been rendered into nothing but a useless brick. Likely, everything else was the same. Elijah wasn't so naive as to think that humanity would react well to the changes. He'd seen people turn into savages after more mundane natural disasters, so it stood to reason that, with survival on the line, people would head down an even less civilized route. Of course, there were plenty of people who would support their neighbors and friends. Good people always outweighed the bad in his experience. However, he also knew it only took a few people willing to enforce their will on others to enslave a much larger population. Human history was evidence of that. He shook his head. Down that line of thinking was nothing but despair, which was a very real threat in his situation. Elijah needed to keep his spirits up, lest the isolation and brutal environment be allowed to replace it with despondency. If that happened, he'd soon surrender to depression and wither away. And he refused to let that happen. The best cure for that kind of thing was to keep busy, to create manageable goals, to take the wins he could get. So, he ran his hand through his lengthening hair, closed his eyes, and took a deep, centering breath before climbing to his feet. He pushed his makeshift door, which was made of sticks that had been bound together with his homemade cordage, aside and ducked outside the shelter. His main fire burned merrily in its pit, reminding Elijah of his half-finished project. He glanced toward the back of the cabin, where he'd been building a fireplace with stones and clay he'd harvested from the stream. It was arduous work, which meant he'd limited his efforts to only working on it a bit each day, but it was coming along. Hopefully, he would finish it by the onset of winter. Flexing his shoulders, Elijah dragged Ethera from his core and sent a pulse of touch of nature through his body. When he'd initially used the spell, he'd done so with very focused intent, which was perfect for healing wounds. However, over the past month and a half, he'd discovered that he could use it without intentional direction. When he did, the Ethera of the spell spread throughout his entire body, healing the minute tears in his muscle fibers that came from exertion, curing his fatigue and hastening his recovery by a large degree. Usually, it took a couple of pulses, but that wasn't a big deal. He had Ethera to spare, considering he only had the one spell. Hopefully, that would soon change, but he really couldn't be sure when he'd get another spell. Grabbing his spear, a coil of line, and a wooden container he'd carved from a piece of stump, Elijah set off toward his fishing spot. He took a circuitous route, heading toward the snare lines he'd laid. They had yet to be successful, but he hoped they'd soon bear fruit in the form of small woodland creatures he could eat. Thankfully, the hares and squirrels hadn't been transformed like the crabs. Otherwise, he'd be in real trouble. He checked his snare lines, but he'd once again failed to catch any prey. However, he did find a stand of mushrooms that he could add to his stash back at the cabin. He slipped each morsel into a satchel he'd crafted from woven grass and lined with his shirt. Soon, he'd have to find some sort of replacement clothing, or he'd die from exposure. At least the weather hadn't really turned yet, even if Elijah knew it was coming. Slowly, he made his way to what he referred to as his fishing hole. Nestled on the shore almost a mile from where he'd battled the crabs, It was characterized by a deep pool almost 30 yards across which connected to the sea by a narrow channel. The best spot from which to cast his line lay atop a large boulder that he wouldn't have been able to climb without his recent physical gains. Now, though, so long as he was careful, it wasn't difficult, and he soon found himself threading his homemade hook with his similarly handmade line. Once that was done, he baited the hook with a piece of rancid crab, then tossed it into the water. Once it had settled, he wove the line around his arm, from elbow to palm, then started to gradually pull it in. The first cast was unsuccessful. So was the second. But on the third he got a bite. However, when he pulled it in, he saw that the fish had only taken the bait. That was the problem with his hooks. Well, one of them, at least. They only managed to do their job about half the time. But Elijah was persistent, and on the 10th cast, he finally pulled in a fish. Like most of the other fish he'd caught over the past 6 weeks, it appeared to be a steelhead trout. However, it had clearly been mutated just like the crabs had been. Its fins were larger, its body sleeker, and its teeth much more prominent. But fortunately, this mutated variant still tasted the same as every other trout Elijah had ever eaten. More importantly, despite looking like it would be a fearsome predator in the water, it had the same weakness that afflicted almost every other marine animal. It couldn't breathe outside of the water. Elijah pulled it on top of the boulder, but he gave it a wide berth as it flopped around. He'd have preferred to end its suffering with a swift strike from his axe, but when he'd tried that with the first fish he'd caught, it had ended with the thing flopping around at the wrong time and latching onto his forearm. Without touch of nature, he'd have quickly bled out from that wound, so he decided to simply let the fish suffocate from now on. Still, it wasn't a pleasant thing to watch, even if he knew it was necessary. He'd never been particularly averse to hunting or fishing, but watching an animal suffer was something wholly different. Even so, he forced himself to watch. Part of that was practical. He wanted to be alert in case the fish got close to the edge. He couldn't afford to lose it, and he would throw caution to the wind to avoid that eventuality. But the other reason he made himself watch was because he wanted to be aware of the cost of his own survival. Elijah had long since come to terms with hunting and consuming other animals. Back in the civilized world, before the system descended and changed everything, it was possible to avoid eating meat. And for the past few years, he had, mostly. But there was a marked difference between eating meat because you liked it and doing so because you needed the protein and fat if you wanted to survive. That shift in his mindset had given Elijah some insight into the natural order. Animals didn't care about the morality of killing another animal for food. They just did what they had to do. In that way, nature was brutal. However, most animals shied away from wanton killing as well. For them, there were no trophies. Just a meal and another day of survival. Elijah had gradually adopted that mindset as his own. When the fish died, he felt an influx of foreign Ethera flow from the trout and into his mind, where it spread through the branching conduits of his soul and, finally, into his core, where he felt something shift. He gasped at the resulting flash of power, and when it settled, he didn't need to see the notification to know that he'd reached level 2. Elijah let out a sigh of relief. Now, it was time to see what benefits a level brought with it. Elijah sat on the boulder, the trout forgotten as he looked at the notification that had come with the jolt of power to which he'd been subjected after reaching the 2nd level. Congratulations! You have reached level 2, earning 2 free attribute points. Would you like to allocate free attribute points? Elijah already knew what he had planned, so he slotted the 2 points into his regeneration attribute. His reasoning wasn't complicated. Regeneration was the only attribute that did 2 things. First, it would help him heal from wounds more quickly. He already had touch of nature for that, but there had been plenty of times when he hadn't wanted to waste his limited Ethera on minor injuries. Now, those nagging issues would heal that much more quickly. But more importantly, the second function of the regeneration attribute was what he was really after: Ethera regeneration. The faster he could regain the energy he spent, the more he could use touch of nature. Besides, he was already gaining physical attributes like strength and dexterity via his frequent workouts. He had a suspicion that that wouldn't last forever, though, so he wanted to get as much as he could out of his routine before investing any points in the physical attributes. After assigning his attributes and confirming his choices, Elijah opened his status to inspect his gains. And he wasn't disappointed. His regeneration had increased by 2 points. Elijah Hart, level 2, archetype, Druid, class, not applicable. Specialization, not applicable. Alignment, not applicable. Strength, dexterity, constitution, 11. Regeneration, movement, nature, cultivation, body, fund. After he reached level 3, Elijah intended to invest an additional point in regeneration before focusing on Ethera. Once that was up to 10 points, he would start working on his other attributes. Hopefully, by then, he would know the limits of his physical training, which would give him enough information to make the right choices. The same line of thinking told him to get everything to 10, then specialize from there based on his experiences. Indeed, there was a part of him that just wanted to throw everything into his physical attributes. Being stronger, more coordinated, or more durable never hurt anyone. However, because of his archetype, he expected that he would become increasingly more reliant on his spells. Those required Ethera, and he was almost certain that he'd eventually outgrow the meager size of his core. No, for better or worse, he was on the path of a spellcaster, and aside from being fit enough to survive, he needed to assign his attributes along those lines. Fortunately, there was no ambiguity about what each attribute did, so he could make his plans with at least some degree of certainty. Sighing, he closed his status before opening a new window. This one described his archetype and, more importantly, the spell that came with his new level. How he knew he'd get one, he wasn't sure, but that knowledge was firmly entrenched in his mind. Archetype, Druid. The Druid is the defender, ally, and cultivator of nature. Features bonuses to natural regeneration, energy density, and one with nature. Required aspects. Scholar, nature, touch of nature. Harness the power of nature to heal yourself or an ally. Snaring roots. Call upon nature to summon a snarl of roots to bind your enemy's movements. That had potential, depending on how strong those roots turned out to be. Certainly, it could help him kill the crabs, or more importantly, help him escape if he made a mistake. Even with his experience and a proven technique, killing the crustaceans was no sure thing. More than once, he'd picked a fight he couldn't win and been forced to retreat, frustrated and wounded. But with this new spell, perhaps his hunting would become safer. And given that Elijah's survival was balanced on the edge of a knife, safer was always better. He ached to try it out, but there were no enemies about. So, he reluctantly went back to fishing. And over the next few hours, Elijah had decent success, catching 4 more fish, which he gutted and cleaned before tossing the offal into the water. Then, with his catch in hand, he set off back toward the cabin, where he intended to use some of the wild herbs and mushrooms to make a fish stew. It wasn't the tastiest thing around due to a lack of proper spices, but it was better than his initial attempts at cooking the crab. Along the way, though, a familiar foreboding sent a shiver up his spine, and he let out a sigh. He knew his stalker had returned, no surprise there. Even when he didn't have a basket full of fresh fish, it rarely let him walk through the forest unobserved. "Come for your tribute, huh?" he said as calmly as he could. Still, there was a slight tremble of fear in his voice. He liked to think that he and the cat, whatever it was, had an understanding, but the fact was that he could very well have been fooling himself. It was a wild animal, and judging by his senses, almost assuredly far deadlier than he could hope to be. He had no idea what was going through its mind. Even so, now that he'd started down this path, he knew that trying to stop wouldn't be smart. So, he grabbed 3 of the fish and tossed them onto the ground before saying, "Eat well, your majesty." Then he backed away. There was a rustle in the nearby brush before a huge shape appeared. Elijah's jaw dropped as he beheld the creature. In a lot of ways, it looked like a panther. But he'd seen panthers before, and none of them were even half this monster's size. In fact, this creature was closer to the size of a tiger than the panthers Elijah had seen. But that wasn't the only thing that made him wary. It also had a few characteristics that distinguished it from any other panther or other animal Elijah had ever seen. For one, everything about it seemed exaggerated. From its musculature to the size of its teeth or claws, it was all too much. On top of that, it bore a white stripe down its spine that branched down to its ribs, slowly fading into black. And then there were its eyes. Emerald green and glistening with intelligence, they told Elijah that he wasn't dealing with some mundane animal. Like the tree, this creature was magical in nature. More than anything, Elijah wanted to turn and run. While pursuing his doctorate, he'd worked as an intern at a local zoo. And once, he'd seen a lion turn on one of its keepers. It had been a massacre that the woman had barely survived, and that only because the animal hadn't really been interested in killing her. If it had been, there was no chance she would have survived. And this creature was almost twice the size of a typical lion. It also moved with unnatural grace, telling Elijah that its bulk wouldn't slow it down. If he ran, it would pounce, and there would be nothing he could do about it. Even with the local wildlife having been transformed, this creature was an apex predator. The panther stepped forward, its green eyes locked on Elijah. It moved slowly, carefully, and with deadly silence. Elijah's heart thundered in his chest even as a cold sweat broke out across his brow. If the panther attacked, he could use his new spell. He had his spear, and he was almost as fit as he'd been before his cancer diagnosis. But instinctively, he knew none of that would matter. He was inferior in every single way, and he only lived because it chose to let him live. It ducked its head and snapped up one of the fish. It swallowed it in a second before eating the second, then the third. Before Elijah knew it, the panther had finished eating the overlarge trout. Then, it shifted its gaze to Elijah's basket. It wanted more. He swallowed hard before slowly retrieving one of his 2 fish from the basket, then tossing it toward the panther. The fish landed only a few feet away from the panther, but it didn't even look at it. Instead, its eyes remained locked on the basket. "Oh, come on." A low growl cut him off. With no more complaining, Elijah threw his remaining fish toward the huge panther, who snapped both up just as quickly as it had the first few. Then, without any hesitation, it turned around and melted back into the undergrowth. In the space of a second, it was gone. Elijah stood there for a couple of minutes, unable to move. He could barely even breathe. But then resentment set in. He just wasted half the day so he could feed a giant cat. Now, he had no choice but to go back to his fishing hole and hope he could catch something else. Sighing, he did just that, and by the time he reached it, the sun had already passed its zenith and was heading toward the horizon. In a few hours, it would be dusk, so he knew he'd only have time to get a single fish. Maybe 2 if he was lucky. "Unless that stupid cat decides to shake me down again," he muttered, tossing his line into the water. Almost immediately, he felt a nibble and he grinned. Perhaps his luck was changing. He tugged on the homemade string, wrapping it around his elbow. But the fish on the end of the line wasn't going to come in without a fight. Still, Elijah was an old hand at fishing, and he continued to work the line until he felt it go slack. At first, he thought that the line had broken. It wouldn't have been the first time, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But then he saw a dark shadow in the water before. Suddenly, something burst forth from the waves. Elijah only got a brief view of scales and sharp teeth before he threw himself backwards. He tumbled off the boulder and to the ground below, and by some miracle, managed to keep from breaking his neck. When he looked up, he saw an abomination looking down at him. It was dark blue-green in color, with 4 arms, glistening scales, and a face that looked like it belonged to some bottom-dwelling monstrosity. The monster, and it definitely was a monster, there was no doubt, screeched at him before launching itself into the air. For a split second, Elijah froze. But then, instincts born of uncountable hours in the boxing ring took over, and Elijah dove aside. His brief hesitation cost him, though, and a line of fire erupted across his back. He screamed as he was sent rolling across the rocky shore. With adrenaline coursing through his veins, he ignored the worst of the pain as he pushed himself to his feet. The monster looked at him, then against all odds, its hideous face split into a wide grin. A chill ran up Elijah's spine as he realized that the thing wasn't just a monster. It was that, but it was so much more. It raised one of its claws, then licked Elijah's blood away. Its smile widened. Elijah had a brief moment to take stock of the situation. His spear was atop the boulder, so it was out of reach. He had the flint-bladed axe at his waist, but it was barely even sharp enough to split wood, much less cut through that thing's viridian scales. So it was useless. No, if he wanted to survive, he had only one option. He had to run. So, as the creature advanced, in no apparent hurry, Elijah embraced the Ethera in his core and pushed it into the webwork of channels that constituted his soul. Then he cast snaring roots. The Ethera left his core in a rush, taking all but a third of his reserves, but it went to good use because, a moment later, thick, brown roots erupted from the ground, snaking around the monster's legs. They twisted and turned, ensnaring its entire lower body. Elijah didn't stay to see how far the spell would go, because he knew he only had a narrow avenue of escape. So, once the creature was trapped, Elijah turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush and stumbling over exposed roots. Already, the blood loss was getting to him, but he couldn't afford the time needed to stop and heal. So, he continued to run, hoping that the monster would be reluctant to follow him inland. But only 15 or 20 seconds later, Elijah heard the sounds of the creature's pursuit. He pushed himself, but he just wasn't fast enough. He tripped over a rock he should have been able to avoid, and he went tumbling down a slight incline and into a shallow depression. When he looked up, he saw that the monster had already caught up. His spell had briefly slowed it down, but it was completely insufficient against such a powerful creature. Elijah scrambled back, searching for a weapon. A stick, a rock, anything. He came up empty-handed, and once again, the monster grinned its sickening grin before stepping forward. At the end of his rope, Elijah embraced touch of nature, hoping to heal the wound in his back so he could try to fight the monster off. In the back of his mind, he knew it was useless. With the size of that monster, it was at least 7 feet tall and dense with muscle, and the way it moved, he didn't stand a chance. Even if he'd been armed, those scales looked tough. Perhaps if he'd had something more potent than snaring roots, he would have been able to hold his own. But he had none of those things, so he was almost assuredly going to die. That was okay. Elijah had made peace with his own mortality long ago. On that plane, he'd been ready to die. The fact that he'd gotten even a few more weeks was a miracle. Still, none of that meant he was going to go down without a fight. The Ethera in Elijah's core drained away, fueling touch of nature as the wound in his back healed. It wasn't perfect, it would probably break open the moment he moved. For now, though, it would have to be enough. He'd reevaluate if he somehow managed to survive against the monster. As the Viridian beast slowly advanced, it seemed to be savoring Elijah's fear. He pushed himself to his feet and squared his shoulders, ready for whatever came next. Elijah had managed to close the wound on his back, but with the Viridian monster slowly closing on him, he had other things on his mind. His core was empty, and it would take at least an hour before it recovered to full capacity. And even if he survived that long, he had no way of defeating the creature. It was too fast, too strong, and those scales were far too durable. His only other spell, aside from touch of nature, had already proved insufficient. No, he knew that unless he managed some miraculous feat, he was going to die. After everything that he'd managed to survive, from cancer and the plane crash to carving his own place out of the wilderness, it was frustrating to think that it had all been for nothing. But that wasn't true, was it? The moment he'd recovered from what the doctors had called incurable cancer, he'd accomplished the impossible. Further, there likely weren't that many people who could have survived his experiences after being stranded in the wilderness. Not only was the forest an inhospitable place, full of dangers both hidden and obvious, but he'd even managed to kill a few of those monstrous crabs. He wasn't quite thriving, but he wasn't that far off either. If only he'd chosen an archetype with more combat potential, he might have been capable of standing against the scaled monster. But that wasn't necessarily true either. Without the ability to heal himself, Elijah would have died a dozen times over. And even if he had managed to survive as another archetype, he didn't think he could have done much against the creature slowly walking toward him. Its aura reminded him of the panther with whom he'd made a tentative truce. But it was also wildly different as well. Elijah had no idea if he was imagining the auras of the two creatures, but given that magic had been thrust upon the world, he was prepared to believe that it was real. Either way, with the panther, or whatever it really was, Elijah felt a sense of connection. It was subtle, but something told him that, while it wasn't a native to the area, or even Earth, it still belonged. It was still a part of the wider tapestry that constituted the natural world. But the newcomer was something else entirely. It felt like an outsider, and for some reason, Elijah thought of a virus. A corrupting influence that was both part of the natural world and apart from it. Of course, that wasn't quite right either, and he didn't have the time to contemplate what any of it meant. Not if he wanted to maintain any hope of survival. Slim though it was, Elijah knew that that hope was contingent on his persistence, on his refusal to give in. The moment he surrendered and accepted his fate, he would die. But so long as he kept fighting, that hope would survive. So, he steadied himself and drew the flint-bladed axe from his makeshift belt. It was a poor weapon, but even that was better than facing the thing with only his bare hands. Squaring his shoulders, he gripped the rough haft tightly and muttered, "You want some of this? You're going to have to earn it." To his horror, the monster let out a wheezing sound, which to Elijah's ears, was unmistakably a laugh. Whatever confidence Elijah had managed to muster faded. Then, before Elijah could hype himself back up, the creature pounced. Its claws flashed as they cut through the air, and it was all Elijah could do to dive out of the way. A ripping, tearing sound preceded a great crash as the enemy shredded a nearby tree, a reminder that if those claws made contact with his comparatively soft flesh, there was little he could do. Elijah rolled to his feet just in time to see the tree tip over with a massive crack and the sound of snapping branches. Fortunately, the monster hadn't counted on that, and a moment later, the huge trunk of the tall pine tree thudded down right on top of the monster. Even that seemed insufficient against such a mighty creature, but for a few seconds at least, it was stationary. That was Elijah's moment. He dashed forward, a battle cry on his lips as he raised his homemade axe. He brought it down with all the strength he could gather. His aim was true, and the flint blade found a home in the monster's unprotected side. However, Elijah's heart jumped into his throat when he saw two things. First, his axe shattered into a million pieces, the shards exploding out from the point of impact. A few of them buried themselves in Elijah's unprotected skin, but most went sailing into the surrounding forest. But more troubling was the second thing Elijah noticed. The blow, mighty though it was, didn't even leave a mark. No, that wasn't true. He'd managed to leave the tiniest of scratches, so small that it might have been Elijah's imagination, on one of the monster's scales. It hissed and gurgled, leveraging its four muscular arms beneath the heavy tree trunk. Its claws bit deep into the bark, and it pushed. Meanwhile, Elijah took those few seconds for the opportunity they represented, and the moment he recovered from his ill-advised attack, he rolled to his feet and took off at a sprint. 1 second passed. Then 2, 3. He scrambled over a fallen tree and slid down a slight hill, his passage eased by the ubiquitous moisture that seemed to cling to everything. When he reached the bottom, he regained his feet and continued his flight, hoping to put as much distance as he could between himself and the unassailable monster that had pegged him as prey. A handful of endless seconds passed before Elijah heard the sound of pursuit. Still, he ran, because what else was he supposed to do? He couldn't fight that creature. He couldn't hurt it. He couldn't endure its attacks. He was lucky that he'd managed to survive as long as he had. He dodged between the trees, panting as much from fatigue as from the panic filling his heart. The monster chose a different track. Judging by the sounds of snapping branches and falling trees that dogged Elijah's path, the creature had chosen to simply run through the various obstacles native to the densely forested wilderness. That was probably the only reason it didn't immediately catch him. With its size and single-minded pursuit, it was far less suited for forest traversal. But that didn't mean it wasn't gaining on him. In the end, his doom came in the form of a particularly well-camouflaged route that Elijah never even saw. 1 second he was sprinting through the forest, and the next he was tumbling through the air only to land on his chest. His momentum took him into an awkward roll, and he ended up colliding with a solid berm composed of roots and tightly packed earth. The impact dislocated one of his shoulders and took a few square inches of the skin of his arm. More troubling was the fact that he'd stopped moving. Terror gripped him as he tried to scramble to his feet, but the pain in his shoulder made it difficult to focus. On top of that, that arm was useless, which threw off his balance. Still, he grasped at exposed roots as he tried to continue his flight. But by then, the monster was upon him. Insanely sharp claws bit into his legs as the sound of the creature's hissing laughter mingled with his screams of agony. Elijah lashed out, but he might as well have been kicking a boulder for all the good it did. Even so, he squirmed and kicked as the monster reached down with curious delicacy and turned him over. Oh God, it wanted to see the look on his face as it killed him. That was the only explanation. Elijah's screams turned into a defiant, yet trembling, roar as he continued to resist. But it was useless. The monster was unstoppable, unassailable, unbeatable. It leaned close, its fetid breath filling Elijah's nostrils. Then, a forked tongue slithered out from its lipless mouth to trace a line along Elijah's cheek. It shivered in pleasure. Elijah pressed himself against the ground as he desperately tried to put as much distance as he could between the creature and himself, but it was useless. The ground was as immovable as the creature was inescapable. The monster was also done delaying the inevitable. Dim light glinted off the reptilian creature's viridian scales, shining with a dark, green-blue tint as it unhinged its jaw and opened its mouth. Row after row of teeth glistened in that yawning abyss as it opened wider and wider. Elijah punched out with his good arm, but the monster didn't even flinch at the blow. Why would it? It leaned forward. Inch by inch, Elijah's death crept closer until he could see the blackened flesh inside the creature's mouth. He closed his eyes, resolving to go to his death with stoic defiance. But then a whisper of a sound greeted Elijah's ears, and, suddenly, the weight of the monster's grip disappeared. A mere second later, the sound of splintering trees filled the air, and Elijah flung his eyes open to see two titans locked in furious battle. The panther had pounced on the monster's back, its claws biting deep into its scaly hide. Black blood misted the air as the panther subjected the creature to a furious onslaught of raking claws. Those impenetrable scales split. Its blood flowed, and the monster wailed in hissing agony. A moment later, the panther lost the advantage of surprise, and the monster regained its balance, reaching back and gripping the panther's glossy black fur. But the lithe animal wasn't so easily caught. It dodged with feline grace, its claws continuing to rake at the monster's scaly hide. But it didn't do so without picking up a few injuries of its own. The panther was agile and deadly, but the enemy wasn't without advantages of its own. And it used them as it clamored to turn the tide of battle, its own natural weapons ripping into the panther's fur and tearing through its dense muscles. The panther spat and hissed under the assault, but it didn't let up. Most predators would give up on a hunt if it proved too dangerous, but the scene Elijah witnessed wasn't one of two animals engaged in a natural battle for survival. No, it was a pair of bitter enemies who were compelled, whether it was by choice or instinct, Elijah had no idea, to fight to the bitter end. Using one arm, he dragged himself further away, but he didn't take his eyes from the fight. It seemed to go on for ages, but Elijah knew that less than a minute had passed. The panther leapt away from the monster's sweeping claws, narrowly dodging the attack before it bounded off a nearby tree, changing directions. The tree swayed under the cat's massive weight, and the panther rocketed toward the scaly creature. It tried to react, but the cat was moving too quickly. The panther's claws flashed. Twice. 3 times in less than a second. And when it jumped away, the viridian monster's throat had been destroyed. Pitch black blood flowed from the gaping wound, smothering its shimmering scales in Stygian blackness. It stumbled to its knees, falling forward only to barely catch itself with an outstretched arm that extended to the black blood-soaked ground. Its claws dug furrows into the soft earth, but with a gurgling, hissing roar, it climbed to its feet and faced off against the cat, who was patiently waiting in the shadows. Elijah could only see hints of its tail's movement and shining green eyes, but he could easily imagine it crouching for its next pounce. The monster staggered forward, leaving a trail of black blood. The cat knew it only had to wait it out, though. Its enemy was already weakened, and the viridian monster's strength fled by the second. But then, the monster seemed to remember its original prey, and it turned toward Elijah. Even with its blood gushing from the wound on its stubby neck, the creature managed its horrifying imitation of a smile before it turned its body in Elijah's direction. Elijah shuddered. The monster was on its last legs. Its life was going to end. There was no stopping that. But just as surely, it didn't intend to die alone. Elijah's hand crept to a small hilt at his waist. The flint-bladed knife was not a weapon. Comprised of a single stone that he'd arduously filed into a point before wrapping the narrowest end with his homemade cordage, it was barely even a tool. But it was better than his bare hands. So, with his good arm, he reached down and yanked it from his makeshift belt. Brandishing it in the monster's direction, Elijah pressed his back against the berm and pushed himself to his feet. The monster continued to advance, its pace slowed not by a desire to prolong Elijah's horror, but by its diminishing strength. Elijah was content to wait. Every second that passed brought it closer to death. Perhaps, if he was lucky, it would fall before it even reached him. He was not lucky. With a burst of speed that constituted the last of the monster's strength, it dashed across the short distance. It reared back, its claws glistening with the panther's red blood. But Elijah didn't wait for its attack. Instead, he marshaled the last bit of his own remaining energy and leapt forward, leading the way with his homemade dagger. He knew it wouldn't cut through the monster's viridian scales, but he wasn't aiming for that. Instead, he thrust his knife deep into the wound wrought by the panther's sharp claws. It sank into the creature's black flesh, biting deep until it collided with bone. The monster flinched back, losing its balance as Elijah crashed into it. Elijah screamed as he was thrown free, rolling on his already injured shoulder. He could feel the ripping tendons of the abused joint, but he couldn't stop himself. After a second, he skidded to a stop, and it took him a few more moments to gather his wits and look back at the scene of the battle. And what he saw brought a grim smile to his face. He was so elated that, at first, he didn't even notice the gaping wound drawing a line across his belly. But within a few seconds, fire erupted in his stomach, and he looked down to see his innards falling out. Even more disturbing, when Elijah looked up, he saw his protector slinking forward. The panther had sustained a host of wounds that Elijah hadn't noticed during the battle, and beneath its glossy, black fur, he saw hints of white bone. Half its face had been massacred, and it moved with a pronounced limp. Gathering his intestines, Elijah realized that he was about to die. Stomach wounds weren't immediately fatal, but when a person started spilling his intestines, it was only a matter of time. Soon he'd grow weak and pass out, if not from the wound itself, then from shock or blood loss. So, even if he managed to recover enough Ethera to power Touch of Nature, he wouldn't be conscious to use it. But that was okay. He'd done well for himself, and while he knew he was about to die, he'd stood his ground. And that unstoppable monster was now dead. He only hoped that the panther would survive, which, judging by its wounds, didn't seem likely. It approached, looked at him out of the corner of one baleful green eye, then flopped onto the ground with a pained sigh. Elijah's eyes drooped as he felt the pool of sticky blood gathering beneath him, and finally, he began to dip into unconsciousness. Before Elijah dropped into unconsciousness, he saw a familiar notification that jarred him back to awareness. Congratulations! You have reached level 3, earning 2 free attribute points. Would you like to allocate free attribute points? It was followed closely by another. Congratulations! You have reached level 4, earning 2 free attribute points, 4 total. Would you like to allocate free attribute points? 2 levels? That didn't make any sense. He hadn't done anything. Sure, he jabbed his now ruined, homemade knife into the monster's neck, but Elijah felt certain that he had only hastened its demise. The panther had been the real killer, but the evidence was right in front of him. The system had given him credit, and the resulting Ethera had pushed him to level 4. As he continued to bleed out, Elijah's mind turned sluggish, and his ability to focus slipped further and further away. It was like wading through thick mud just to force his status open and allocate his attribute points. When he finally managed to wrangle his mind into doing what he wanted, he shoved the free attribute points into Ethera, bringing his total up to 8. Immediately, Elijah felt an influx of magical energy as his core doubled in size. Thankfully, the upgrade didn't just provide capacity, but rather, it gave him an amount of energy equal to what he'd get from 4 Ethera, leaving him with a half-full core. The influx was a heady sensation that nearly drove him to distraction, but he once again harnessed his concentration and forced himself to cast Touch of Nature. The healing spell soothed the injury in his stomach, dragging his intestines back into place and sealing the wound. But before it could do much more than patch things up, Elijah's core ran dry. He was still gravely injured, and any movement would threaten to tear the wound open, but he'd bought himself some time. His survival was now all but assured, provided he didn't run afoul of any other monsters. Elijah glanced at the corpse of the scaled creature that had attacked him and shivered. That, of course, brought with it a significant amount of pain. That monster had come out of nowhere, and even with his newly strengthened body and magical powers, it had been completely out of his league. Without the panther, the enormous cat was lying only a few feet away, its breathing shallow and its eyes filled with agony. And it wasn't surprising. The panther had killed the monster, but it had also paid the price. Shallow wounds decorated its entire body, but Elijah's eyes were drawn to the 3 much more serious injuries it had sustained. The most troubling was a long gash along its side. At least 2 feet in length, and gaping open to expose the panther's ribs, it was a ghastly wound that, even in the best of times, would likely spell a wild animal's doom. If infection didn't set in, then perhaps it would have a chance. But given the foul odor coming from the now-dead monster, Elijah considered that unlikely. Next, one of the panther's legs was turned the wrong way, and Elijah saw its broken bones bulging beneath its sleek skin. Finally, the semi-aquatic monster had ripped a chunk of the panther's face off. In short, the huge cat had almost assuredly given its life to save Elijah. Or perhaps it made more sense that the monster was its mortal enemy. After all, though Elijah had been paying tribute to the panther in the form of a daily fish or two, he'd never gotten the sense that it liked or accepted him. In fact, it had always seemed on the edge of killing him outright. The idea that it would protect him, except as a side effect of its true intention, was almost laughable. But still, Elijah owed the animal his life. It was at that moment that he made a choice. If he recovered enough Ethera before the panther succumbed to its wounds, he would try to heal it. If not, then it just wasn't meant to be. With that in mind, Elijah settled back against the tree and waited on his regeneration to refill his core. Slowly, his mind began to churn, drawing the ambient energy in before sending it through his soul and down into his core. The process was both soothing and distracting enough that he wasn't overwhelmed with the pain of his still serious wound. To further distract himself, Elijah opened what he'd begun to affectionately refer to as his spell book. Archetype, Druid. The Druid is the defender, ally, and cultivator of nature. Features bonuses to natural regeneration, energy density, and one with nature. Required aspects. Scholar, nature. Touch of nature. Harness the power of nature to heal yourself or an ally. Snaring roots. Call upon nature to summon a snarl of roots to bind your enemy's movements. One with nature. Draw power from nature. Eyes of the eagle. Briefly enhance your eyesight with the power of a fearsome raptor. As had been the case with both level 1 and 2, he'd gotten spells for each of his new levels. One with nature seemed a bit ambiguous, but the second spell, Eyes of the Eagle, seemed fairly straightforward. And for now, completely useless. Perhaps there would be a situation in the future where having telescopic vision would help, but for now, it would do nothing to help him. What's more, he couldn't spare the Ethera to test either spell out. However, one with nature was definitely intriguing. Drawing power from nature could mean just about anything. Would it let him rapidly regenerate his Ethera? Or perhaps give him an influx of strength? The possibilities were endless, and his speculation occupied his mind until he'd recovered a little more than half his Ethera. Once he'd done that, Elijah pushed himself away from the tree and slowly shifted closer to the panther. By that point, it had been almost an hour since they'd killed the monster, but the cat had yet to succumb to its wounds. Still, its breathing was labored, and Elijah saw pink-tinted foam around its mouth. Clearly, it had internal injuries in addition to the visible wounds. In short, it was dying. Elijah aimed to change that. When Elijah laid his hand on the animal's paw, its only reaction was a shift of its eyes and a slight tensing of its muscles. Perhaps that was the extent of its capability. Closing his eyes, Elijah pulled Ethera from his core, channeling it through the webwork of his soul and into his spell, Touch of Nature. He gasped. Healing someone else was clearly very different than healing himself. For one, he couldn't just place his hand on the appropriate spot and hope for the best. Instead, he needed to know what he wanted to fix before he could heal it. Thankfully, as a trained biologist, Elijah was very familiar with animal physiology, and it didn't take him long to find the issues. Even without the magical awareness that allowed him to sense problems, Elijah would have had a good idea of where to start. With it, he could pinpoint the issues in mere seconds. That's when the other difference between healing himself and healing others surfaced. When targeting himself, Touch of Nature had always felt like being wrapped in a wave of soothing energy that both healed and revitalized him. But with the panther, it felt like he'd just poured a glass of water into a vast ocean. Even with his senses and experience as a scientist guiding him, Elijah knew it was going to take more than a few casts to heal even the least of the panther's wounds. But Elijah was nothing if not persistent. So, he focused on the cat's internal injuries first, using his gathered Ethera to mend the wounds. He managed 3 casts before his core ran dry once again, but he'd managed to staunch most of the internal bleeding. It was less effective than he'd hoped, but it was a start. Over the next day and a half, Elijah fell into a rhythm. Once his core refilled, he would cast Touch of Nature on himself a single time, then use the remainder of his pool of Ethera to repeatedly heal the panther. As he did, he learned a couple of things. First, so long as he kept his mind clear, he could regenerate his entire core in 2 hours. Sometimes, it varied by a couple of minutes, but he chalked the variance up to his inability to keep proper time. After all, he didn't have a clock to consult. If he let his mind wander, his regeneration took a significant hit, so he did everything he could to keep his thoughts from wandering too far afield. The second thing he learned was that the panther was vastly more powerful than him. Elijah had no notion of its level, but it was so far above him that it might as well have been a god. But it was mortal, just like him, and he knew that without his help, the cat would have quickly succumbed to its wounds. It seemed to know that as well, and even after Elijah had healed it enough to keep it from dying, it remained in place. Gradually, Elijah mended both his and the panther's wounds until, after almost 2 days, the job was done, and he slumped in exhaustion. Hunger gnawed at his belly. After all, he hadn't had time or concentration to spare for gathering any food, and fatigue weighed down on him like he carried a mountain on his shoulders. Fortunately, water hadn't been as much of an issue, given that it had rained intermittently throughout the process. The panther pushed itself to its feet, testing its mended leg. Elijah had left it for last, as much to keep the panther in place as because it was the least life-threatening of the cat's many injuries. "Yeah, it's healed," he said tiredly. His own wounds had healed much more quickly, allowing him to focus entirely on the panther. The cat locked its glistening green eyes on him for a long moment. Then, without even a nod of thanks, it padded away, disappearing into the shadows. Elijah sighed. "You're welcome, I guess," he muttered. Then, he turned his attention inward to address a notification pushing against his mind. When he did, his jaw dropped. "Congratulations! You have reached level 5, earning 2 free attribute points. Would you like to allocate free attribute points?" Another notification soon followed. And then another. 3 levels, putting him at 7. That gave him 6 extra attribute points to allocate, but even more exciting than that, he'd gained 3 new spells. It was a nearly overwhelming degree of advancement, and he quickly opened his spell book to investigate his gains. Archetype, Druid. The Druid is the defender, ally, and cultivator of nature. Features bonuses to natural regeneration, energy density, and one with nature. Required aspects. Scholar, nature. Touch of Nature. Harness the power of nature to heal yourself or an ally. Snaring roots. Call upon nature to summon a snarl of roots to bind your enemy's movements. One with nature. Draw power from nature. Eyes of the Eagle. Briefly enhance your eyesight with the power of a fearsome raptor. Ancestral Circle. Create a place of power. Nature's Bounty. Encourage the growth of plants. Storm's Fury. Call forth the power of a storm and harness its might. The first spell felt powerful, but the description didn't give any hints as to what it was supposed to do. Creating a place of power sounded great, but how did it benefit him? He would have to try it out if he wanted to discover the answer to that question. The second spell, Nature's Bounty, at least seemed more straightforward, and he could already see how beneficial it could be. A good portion of his diet depended on foraging, but what if he could create a garden and accelerate its growth? It would change everything about his life in the wilderness. The last spell was clearly Elijah's first attack spell, but beyond that, he wasn't sure what to expect. Storms were deadly, sure, but he wasn't certain how he was supposed to use such power to fight his enemies. Elijah shook his head as he pushed himself to his feet. While healing himself and the panther, he'd rarely moved from that position, and he'd grown stiff. In the past, he'd have had quite a bit of difficulty sitting still for that long, but in the throes of his quest to mend his savior's wounds, moving around had been the last thing on his mind. Then, Elijah remembered that he still needed to allocate his 6 free points. He did so, splitting them between Ethera and regeneration, bringing them to 11 and 12, respectively. His original plan had been to focus on his physical attributes once he got Ethera and regeneration to 10, but he'd never expected to gain so many levels so quickly. He still wanted to get the most out of his physical training, so he'd chosen to focus on his magical attributes for now. Once strength and dexterity plateaued, if they did at all, he would reevaluate his plans. For now, though, Elijah had some spells to test. First up was one with nature, but when he embraced the spell, channeling Ethera from his core and through the pathways of his soul, he got a big shock. His jaw dropped as a cascade of information spread across his mind, telling him how the spell worked. Grinning, he said, "Oh, that's good. Really good. This could change everything." Elijah felt strength flow through him as he felt the effects of one with nature take hold. More, for the first time, the spell came with understanding. It felt as if he'd suddenly remembered a long-lost memory, and the result was that he knew how the new spell worked. And he was impressed. The effects of one with nature were threefold. So long as he remained in contact with natural earth, the spell would enhance his physical attributes. His new understanding wasn't specific about the exact degree of enhancement, but he could feel that it was significant. Further testing would need to be done if he wanted exact information, though. The second facet of the spell's enhancement came in the form of natural healing. It wasn't even close to rivaling his other spell, Touch of Nature, but it would go a long way towards staving off minor injuries and the effects of fatigue. More importantly, the effect it would have on his physical training would almost assuredly be profound. Finally, and he suspected, most importantly, the spell came with a sense of connectivity with the natural world. He'd felt a version of that the moment he'd awoken with his new archetype. However, one with nature enhanced that feeling 100-fold. More than that, though, he could sense the forest's aura of life far more keenly, and within a few feet he almost felt as if he could identify individual organisms. But he suspected that he'd have to grow much stronger for the spell to reach that level, if it ever did. For now, though, he took comfort in the feeling that he was that much closer to belonging in the forest. Elijah also got the feeling that it would protect him from natural predators, at least to some extent. If he antagonized them, they would still react with vicious certainty. However, he felt that they wouldn't instigate anything. Of course, Elijah suspected that something like the panther would be unaffected. He had no gauge or context for its power, but he knew it was too far above him to succumb to any attack or spell he could muster. Not that he wanted to try. No, he'd been disabused of that notion when he'd witnessed the battle between the panther and the monster. That was a battle he had no interest in fighting. After testing one with nature, Elijah glanced at the monster's corpse. It had begun to decompose within an hour of its death, and now, it was little more than a mass of discolored refuse. In the beginning, he'd harbored notions of harvesting its impenetrable scales and using it for armor, but even if it hadn't rotted into a state of uselessness, Elijah was more than a little put off by both the smell and the sense of wrongness that radiated from its body. Even in death, it didn't seem like it belonged in the world, and he wanted nothing more than to let it rot so that it would cease its corrupting influence. Mostly, that aura of corruption had faded, but Elijah still wanted to get away as quickly as he could. So, after a few more seconds, he headed in the direction of the stream. As he did so, he marveled at how much stronger and more vital he felt. "Could definitely get used to this," he muttered. The spell's effects had nearly doubled his physical ability, making traversal through the forest trivial. Soon, he reached the stream, where he stripped off his soiled clothing and washed them as best he could. The endeavor was only a moderate success. The monster's black blood seemed to have suffused everything, right down to the tiniest of fibers, but he did what he could. Next came his body, and though the water had grown much colder since his first encounter with the stream, one with nature made him much more durable, so he barely felt the stream's frigid embrace. Without soap or something abrasive, it took quite a while before Elijah was satisfied with his relative cleanliness, but when he stepped out of the stream, he felt refreshed in a way he hadn't since awakening on the shore after the plane crash. After dressing, Elijah made his way back to the cabin, which was much the same as he'd left it. The fire had been extinguished, and it looked like some small animal had rooted around in his food stores. Not unexpected after 2 days, but still disappointing. Before Elijah got down to trying his other new spells, he set about the task of restarting the fire. He might not have needed as much protection from the cold as he had before using one with nature, but he still didn't want to go through any more nights without a fire. Summer had already faded, and he knew from experience that fall could turn into winter in a matter of days. So, he needed to be prepared for it. As he worked, Elijah continued to feel his way through one with nature, and along the way, he discovered that, once cast, it would remain in place indefinitely. However, he also sensed that his body only had room for a single augmentation of its nature. Part of that feeling came from the information he'd been granted alongside the spell, but he could also feel the subtle way the spell stretched his soul. Any more and it would collapse. But that was fine by Elijah. He didn't have any other augmentations to cast, so he didn't have to worry about it. For now. Perhaps he'd have to revisit the problem in the future, though. In any case, once Elijah restarted the fire, he took a few minutes to test the other new additions to his spell book. After one with nature, the next one on the list was Eyes of the Eagle, which gave him a brief duration of telescopic vision. After casting it for the first time, he looked down at the ground and could see everything as if it was under a weak microscope. It wasn't powerful enough that he could see microbes or individual cells, but he suspected that wasn't the purpose. Instead, it was meant to give him the means to see long distances, and he expected that it would accomplish that goal very well. The next new spell was Ancestral Circle, which, for now, proved useless. However, like his other spells, it did come with a thorough understanding of the spell's purpose. And that was enough to make Elijah's jaw drop. Unlike Elijah's other spells, Ancestral Circle required significant preparation. Once he chose an appropriate spot, and the moment he understood the requirements, he knew precisely where he wanted to put it. He would have to plant a series of trees in a perfect circle. Then, he would have to empower that circle with his spell. Once that was done, the true purpose of Ancestral Circle would be available to him. And it could be summed up in one word: teleportation. It was limited, but the idea was that he could use the second portion of the spell to instantly transport himself from anywhere in the world to his circle, which the burst of information he'd received with the spell referred to as a grove. He could only do so once a week, but it was an incredible ability. Still, it would take a vast amount of work to create his grove. He was so eager to get started that he very nearly set off to his chosen spot right then and there. But good sense won out, and he moved on to the second-to-last spell he'd received after healing the panther. Nature's Bounty was far more straightforward than any of his other spells. He only had to channel his Ethera from his core and through his soul before casting the spell, and it would cause rapid plant growth within a 10-yard radius. Of course, to plants, rapid meant that it would only take weeks for a plant to reach maturity, but that was still a huge boon. Already, Elijah's task of growing his grove had gone from being a project of years to one that might only take months. Doubtless, the two spells were intended to be used in tandem. Finally, Elijah's exploration of his spell book reached Storm's Fury. Ever since learning that his transformed world was one of magic, Elijah had imagined being a grand wizard and slinging fireballs at his enemies. Of course, he knew that wasn't what being a druid was all about, but even so, he'd become enamored with the fantasy, and he'd found himself hoping that his path would include something of the like. And now it did. Standing a couple of dozen yards away from his cabin, Elijah sighted in on a rock he'd placed 20 feet away. Then, as he had with every other spell, Elijah dragged Ethera from his core and pushed it through the pathways of his soul and into the spell he wanted to cast. And for a split second after he released it, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, a bolt of lightning tore through the forest canopy and hit the ground 5 feet away from the rock. Electricity spiderwebbed across the ground for another few feet before dissipating, leaving only a few tendrils of wispy smoke snaking up from the point of impact. Elijah grinned. On the one hand, the spell seemed incredibly powerful. He knew the power of that much electricity, and he could surmise that it could be a potent weapon. But on the other hand, he'd missed his target, and badly. Clearly, he needed to practice. That was okay. He was nothing if not persistent, and it wouldn't take a significant shift to add target practice to his exercise regimen. The only big problem was that the spell was incredibly Ethera hungry, and it had taken almost a third of his capacity to cast it a single time. Not ideal, but Elijah was used to that. Once he'd finished exploring his new spells, Elijah set about replenishing his food stores, gathering mushrooms and berries as he walked around the forest. Eventually, his path took him to the meadow that was home to the powerful tree that had eased the cultivation of his body of wood. When he arrived, he noticed something peculiar. The meadow was perfectly circular. It was as if it had been made to accommodate his grove. Perhaps it had. Or maybe the tree had influenced the area for that purpose. Whatever the case, it was precisely what Elijah needed. He'd already decided to use the tree's thick aura to his advantage when placing his grove, and the discovery was just further evidence that he was on the right track. But with the sun dipping toward the horizon, he didn't have time to get started just yet. Instead, he gathered more berries, some dogbane for more cordage, and a few dozen acorns that had fallen from the tree. The arboreal spirit that dwelled within still seemed dormant, but Elijah hoped that it would awaken soon. After all, if it had guided him through the process of cultivating his body, then it was probably full of other useful information. Once he was finished, Elijah trekked back to his cabin, where he enjoyed a meal of berries and mushrooms before, at last, releasing one with nature and letting himself fall asleep. When Elijah awoke the next day, he held off on reapplying the augmentation as he went through the daily regimen of exercise he'd established before the fight against the Viridian-scaled monster. However, instead of being confined to physical exercise, he interspersed target practice into the routine. He still had to stop and concentrate before he could focus enough to cast Storm's Fury, but by the end of his workout, he'd progressed noticeably. His aim was still lacking, especially if he rushed through it, but he'd found that the process of casting the spell came quicker every time he did it. It was still alien, but like any process, it was on its way to becoming instinctive. Now, he only had to spend the time necessary to push it over the edge to where he could use the spell without thought. Of course, that wasn't something he could accomplish in mere hours. Instead, it was a task of weeks. Or perhaps months. Maybe it would even be years. But stranded in the wilderness, he had time to spare. More than that, he had plenty of motivation to get it right. After all, that monster had come at him out of nowhere, and if the panther hadn't saved him, Elijah would have been slain. Even with the cat's help, it had been a close thing. The new world wasn't benign. It was deadly. And if Elijah wanted to avoid ending up as some monster's lunch, he needed to grow more powerful. To that end, he redoubled his efforts and leveraged every ounce of his focus as he continued to practice his aim, one lightning bolt at a time. Elijah crouched at the tree line, watching the crabs scuttle across the rocky shore. Then he tossed a bit of fish entrails only a few feet away from the most isolated crustacean. It took the creature a moment to notice it, but when it did, it wasted no time before skittering across the rocks and gobbling it up. That's when Elijah tossed another bit of fish guts a little further away. After the crab found that one, too, he repeated the process. That's how, a few feet at a time, Elijah led the crustacean away from its fellows. Once it was sufficiently isolated, he struck. Not with the homemade spear in his hand, but with magic. A thin bolt of lightning, barely visible in the harsh light of the winter sun, descended from the sky to hit the crustacean in the center of its muddy brown shell. It let out a shriek as it convulsed, its limbs spasming out of control as it flopped to the gravelly ground. But Elijah knew from experience that it wasn't dead. It would take 2 more strikes, and all the Ethera in Elijah's core, for the monster to succumb. He quickly recast the spell, to similar results. Finally, he finished it off with a 3rd cast. Elijah sighed. For all the excitement he'd felt when he'd gotten his first attack spell, It had proven to be a bit of a mixed bag. While the spell did allow him to hunt in relative safety, it wasn't nearly as powerful as he'd hoped it would be. Clearly, the Druid archetype was no mighty wizard, even if it gave Elijah a single attack spell. Rising from his cover, Elijah trotted to where the crab had died, then set to harvesting it. He'd done so dozens of times over the past 8 weeks, so he found the task boring but ultimately necessary. After all, with the onset of winter, the fish had retreated into deeper waters, leaving his once fertile fishing hole desolated. The crabs, along with his stores of mushrooms and berries, were his only consistent source of food. Sure, Elijah managed to kill a few hares and squirrels here and there, but those instances were so infrequent that he knew he couldn't rely on them when it came to his survival. Of course, if things got really bad, there were always the bugs he felt crawling through the earth. They wouldn't be pleasant, but Elijah expected that they would provide some sustenance. Still, he wasn't quite at the point where he needed to resort to eating insects. He was tired of crab, but it was still better than eating crickets and grubs. Yeah. My standards are sky high, he muttered to himself. Other animals had no problems eating bugs. It was the same with many human cultures as well. But Elijah found the idea disgusting. Even so, he knew that if he got hungry enough, he'd start digging through the dirt like any other hungry animal. Only he had an advantage. With nature, he could feel everything within a few feet, and the ground was no barrier to the ability. No, he was perfectly suited for bug hunting. He just didn't want to do it. So, he hunted crab. Fortunately, there seemed to be an endless number of the creatures, which didn't seem all that surprising. Purple shore crabs had always been very populous, and the onset of the system hadn't changed that. At first, Elijah had wondered if the creatures would simply starve. After all, with greater mass came the need for a more plentiful food source. But that problem had been solved by the corpses of sea creatures that regularly washed ashore. Most were half-rotted and bore severe wounds, but the crabs didn't seem to mind. They had always been scavengers, after all. Soon enough, Elijah finished harvesting the crab, putting the meat in a huge basket he'd woven from sticks, dried reeds, and leaves. Once he'd finished, he set the basket aside and repeated the process, killing and harvesting another crab. He didn't need the meat for himself, but still, he felt compelled to feed, or perhaps pay tribute to the panther, which he'd only seen a handful of times over the past 8 weeks. Gathering his huge basket, it was at least 3 feet across, Elijah began the trek back to the cabin. About halfway there, he felt the presence of the panther bearing down on him. It wasn't as suffocating or terror-inducing as it once had been, but it was still enough to make him sweat. He set the basket down, then piled half of the meat on the forest floor. "Your tribute, your majesty," he said, his voice loud and slightly mocking. "Feels sort of like it should be the other way around, though. You're the mighty hunter, right? You should be feeding me." The forest stilled, and a wave of oppressive power washed over Elijah. Unperturbed, he said, Fine. You're the king around here. I know my place." The feeling disappeared. Elijah wasn't certain if the cat could understand him. He suspected that it could, after a fashion, but he didn't really care. The panther hadn't killed him yet, so he didn't think it was suddenly going to change its mind over a snarky comment. Besides, Elijah had studiously held up his end of the bargain by providing food. The cat had no reason to kill him, but it was still a wild animal, wasn't it? As such, it was unpredictable. There was no telling what might set the panther off. Then again, it was far more intelligent than any wild animal Elijah had ever seen, even dolphins or chimps. So, applying his previous experiences might not be the best idea. Whatever the case, they seemed to have a mutually beneficial arrangement, and Elijah wasn't going to do anything to mess that up. So, he added a few handfuls of crab meat to the pile before saying, "There you go. Next time one of those monsters attacks, remember who feeds you, yeah?" Predictably, the panther didn't give voice to his agreement. Nor did it show itself at all, and without the cat's oppressive aura, Elijah would have thought that he was talking to empty air. But he knew the cat was there. It had heard him, and he suspected that it understood. That would have to be enough. With that, Elijah continued back to the cabin. Along the way, he kept an eye out for mushrooms and berries, but with the onset of winter and his constant foraging, he found nothing. It would have been troubling if he hadn't amassed a significant store of food. And it had finally gotten cold enough that he didn't have to worry nearly so much about spoilage, even with the crab meat. That was a boon, even if it came with the decidedly less pleasurable side effect of him being cold all the time. He'd tried his best to guard against it, making rudimentary clothing out of woven grass and the few rabbit pelts he'd managed to acquire, but it was mostly ineffective. Still, with his increased constitution as well as the constant enhancement that came with one with nature, it wasn't so bad. Even though the days had continued to grow colder, he felt that unless things got much worse than was normal for the Pacific Northwest, he would survive. It wouldn't be comfortable, but that was true of most of his life now. After storing everything away in raised boxes he'd carved, Elijah added some more wood to his fire, then set off toward his budding grove. The trip was mostly uneventful, save for when he ran into a rapidly decomposing monster corpse. It looked different than the one he and the cat had fought. Smaller, and somehow less oppressive. However, it was still an alien creature that could, and would, if it got the chance, rip him to shreds. Thankfully, the Panthers seemed to take hunting them as its personal mission, and over the past 8 weeks, Elijah had run into a handful of other monster corpses. Leaving it behind, there was nothing useful about it. Elijah continued on his way until he reached the grove. In some ways, the meadow containing the huge tree was the same. The dimensions hadn't changed, nor had the tree itself. However, about 30 feet from the natural tree line, there was now a ring of saplings. They were barely taller than Elijah himself, but even that much growth was so abnormal as to be considered miraculous. Part of their rapid growth was due to his daily usage of nature's bounty, but Elijah suspected that it was also a characteristic of the trees themselves. After all, they'd come from acorns he'd gathered from around the majestic tree at the center of the meadow, and he knew good and well that it wasn't normal. The ambient Ethera of the area had also increased significantly, and Elijah could keenly feel its nature aspect. It was soothing and energizing, and it increased the regeneration of his core significantly. Normally, it would take him 2 hours to regenerate the Ethera in his core, but in the grove, it was cut down to a quarter of that. And that increased regeneration had allowed him to make abundant use of nature's bounty, which in turn had continued to increase his regeneration. It was a perpetuating cycle, and one for which Elijah was extremely grateful. Without it, his grove would have taken much longer. After completing 2 circuits through the circle of saplings, Elijah went deeper into the grove until he reached 10 neat rows of turned soil. From that soil sprouted dozens of small plants that would, Elijah hoped, eventually become berry bushes that would, in turn, make gathering food much easier. But the bushes were in their infancy, and it would be weeks before they bore fruit. Still, the fact that they'd sprouted at all was a good sign for Elijah's long-term survivability. Elijah planted himself in the center of his nascent garden, crossing his legs and activating nature's bounty. His spell's range was just wide enough to encompass the entire garden by design, so once activated he only had to sit and keep it going. So, that's what he did. However, as he did so, he focused on the network of pathways and channels that constituted his soul. It was metaphysical in nature, so his only concept of how it worked came from feeling the Ethera as it traced its way through the network. However, a few weeks before, he discovered that he could guide and accelerate the process, dumping extra Ethera into the spell and making it more potent. Or that's what he thought. There were no manuals to read, and Elijah could only go by what he felt. But he expected that it was one of the reasons behind the garden's rapid growth. In any case, it didn't seem to be hurting anything, so he kept at it, pushing at the boundaries of his soul's pathways. That was how Elijah spent the next few hours until his soul started to ache. The first time he discovered the process, Elijah had pushed through the pain. A mistake, as it happened, because he'd eventually pushed himself too far, resulting in an inability to use any Ethera at all for the next 2 days. So, the moment he felt that ache in his soul, Elijah cut the spell off. Looking up, he saw that there was still plenty of daylight left, so he decided to explore a little. He still had little concept of the area beyond his immediate surroundings, so he'd resolved to spend a bit of time each day in exploration. Before he started, though, Elijah knew he needed to refill his core. So, he waited about 20 more minutes before he set off toward the east. Clutching his new, homemade flint-bladed spear, Elijah trekked inland through the dense forest. 1 hour passed, then 2. Along the way, he gathered the few mushrooms and berries that had managed to stubbornly resist the effects of winter. He also saw signs of game, but he didn't run into any animals. Eventually, though, Elijah crested a small hill only to find himself atop a sheer cliff that dropped off at least 200 feet. Below him, the canopy of the forest ran on for at least a couple more miles until it abruptly ended at the sea. It's an island. Indeed, Elijah could see the curve of the shore a few miles in the distance. Of course, it still could have been a peninsula, but he didn't think that was the case, for some indefinable reason. In any case, Elijah could see more land stretching across the horizon in the distance. Miles of turbulent sea separated Elijah from the mainland, but at least he wasn't stranded in the middle of the ocean. Finally finding a use for Eyes of the Eagle, Elijah embraced the spell, then channeled Ethera from his core and through his soul. Immediately, his vision sharpened, and he could see the distant shore as if it was only a few hundred yards away. And what he saw was both troubling and exciting. It seemed that he was not as alone as he thought he was. From the top of the cliff, Elijah studied the encampment across the strait separating his island from what he expected was the mainland, and what he found was inexplicably infuriating. With Eyes of the Eagle, he could clearly see the beginnings of a primitive town nestled at the foot of a mountain. The low-slung buildings had been constructed of seamless concrete, or some magical variant, he expected, from which grew thick smokestacks that were steadily belching black clouds into the otherwise pristine air. The town was surrounded by thick forests not unlike what Elijah had found on his island, but the inhabitants had waged a war against the flora, clearing large swathes of trees in the process. No doubt, they had been used as fuel for their fires. Or perhaps they'd been used to construct the sturdy-looking barges moored at the town's simplistic dock. Either way, the sight filled Elijah with a degree of sorrow he couldn't adequately describe. He'd never really been an environmentalist, not like many of his colleagues. Certainly, he'd always tried to conserve where he could, and he had never been an unrepentant polluter, but he also knew that environmental issues were far more complicated than the hardcore activists wanted to admit. In a vacuum, it was easy to tell people to drive electric cars or eschew eating meat, but those were solutions only available to a select few. Others had to do what they had to do, regardless of environmental consequences. That wasn't to say that Elijah didn't want to hold industry accountable for their profit-driven choices. He did. He just understood that things were far less simple than they might appear to be at first glance. However, when he looked upon that decimated forest and the billowing black smoke, he felt a degree of anger he'd never felt before. Clearly, that was his nature aspect, and the connection that came with his archetype, screaming at him. He did his best to push it to the back of his mind, but it was difficult. The fact that the inhabitants of that town didn't appear to be human helped, though. Elijah didn't know what any of them were called, but he saw creatures that reminded him of stereotypical fantasy dwarves, gnomes, and goblins, all of which were working together. Soon, Elijah noticed a flood of the small-statured creatures pour out of what he thought was a mountain cave. Upon further inspection, though, he saw that each of those people, if indeed that was the right word, was carrying a mining pick. After that, it didn't take much longer for Elijah to notice the carts full of unrefined ore, though he was too far away to utilize his limited geological knowledge to identify what it was. Elijah stood there, watching the town from miles away, until he could confidently say that the entire settlement was a mining operation. Likely, the chimneys belching clouds of billowing black smoke were connected to smelters, from which they would extract metal from the raw ore. More than that, though, Elijah saw that the refined metals were taken to the biggest building, which looked more elaborate than all the rest. For some reason, he didn't think he was looking at a warehouse. The building was too elaborate and far too small to serve that purpose. And given that his own spell, Ancestral Circle, had a teleportation component, it didn't take him long to guess that the alliance of dwarves, gnomes, and goblins had access to something similar. Or perhaps he was wrong. He was still far too new to the transformed world to understand what was and wasn't possible. However, he felt unreasonably confident in his assertions. For a while, Elijah wondered what he should do. The distance from the island to the town wasn't short, at least 10 miles, but probably more than that, separated him from the coast. So, it would not be an easy trip, even if he managed to construct a raft of some sort. He never even considered swimming. Seeing the transformation of the trout, with all their extra teeth, was enough to dissuade him from that notion. And that wasn't even considering that the monster that had almost killed him had come from the sea. Who knew what else was down there? After a while, Elijah realized that, while the discovery was interesting, it didn't really affect his situation. With the inability to cross the strait, the best he could do was create a bonfire and hope they saw it. Then, he'd have to hope that they were friendly, which wasn't entirely likely, given that the town's inhabitants weren't even human. No, nothing had changed, save for the fact that he needed to be on his guard. Which was the same as always. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Elijah reluctantly turned away and started back toward his cabin. Fortunately, he'd long since mastered traversal through the thick foliage, so he made good time back to the grove. There, he did a circuit around the clearing, keeping nature's bounty active, before he retreated to his cabin where prepared some stew, which was comprised of seaweed, crab meat, and mushrooms. So, the same thing he ate most days. As he sat there spooning the stew into his mouth, Elijah was struck by a deep sense of longing. It wasn't the first time he'd missed his old life and, more importantly, people, but after seeing civilization so close, the feeling came back with a vengeance. With their setup, the dwarves, gnomes, and goblins were probably eating like kings. Even if they didn't have access to teleportation, which, for some reason he couldn't explain, he doubted, their area was probably home to plenty of game. Deer, wild hogs, and a multitude of other edible animals were native to the region, and the thought of enjoying a nice venison steak filled Elijah with a deep sense of longing. Of course, he also missed his friends. He wished he could talk to his sister. Or her family. Idly, Elijah wondered how everyone else in the world was doing. Were they struggling to survive, just like him? Or were things easier in the cities? Were there even cities left? The world had supposedly been rearranged, so there was no guarantee that there hadn't been more changes. He sighed. For now, mere survival was difficult enough. But what about the future? Would he be content to remain an island hermit for months? Perhaps years? He needed more than that. He needed a purpose. The problem was that Elijah had never been burdened with anything of the sort. After his parents had died, he'd thrown himself into his schoolwork, eventually getting his doctorate despite not really being passionate about marine biology. Sure, it was interesting enough and he did enjoy it, but only as a job. It was never a purpose. But now magic was real. The impossible was now possible. Not that long ago, he'd spoken to a tree. With a mere thought, he could call lightning from the sky. Not to mention his healing abilities. He had power. The question was how he wanted to use it. The problem was that he didn't know the answer to that fundamental question, and he wasn't sure if he would figure it out anytime soon. Not that it was urgent. Staying alive in such an unforgiving world was hard enough to occupy most of his focus. So, for the time being, he just had to keep going, and that wouldn't change until at least the spring. With that thought, Elijah let sleep overtake him. When he awoke the next morning, he embarked on his daily routine of exercise and target practice. At first, his physical attributes had improved, but they'd stalled out at 9 points, which just seemed to confirm his suspicions that if he wanted to go past 10, he would need to allocate his points appropriately. Still, with his ability to heal, he felt better than he had since college. He was only 30 years old, but they'd been a hard 30 years filled with sports injuries. But with constant usage of Touch of Nature, the remnants of those injuries, which had presented themselves via nagging aches and pains, had faded to nothing, leaving him whole and hale. If he'd had proper nutrition, Elijah would have been in the best shape of his life. After his target practice, Elijah headed to his nascent grove, where he completed his daily circuit powered by nature's bounty. The saplings seemed to have grown a few inches, and his garden of berry bushes had continued to sprout. Soon enough, he hoped to have a proper grove. Once it crossed whatever arbitrary threshold that was imposed by his spell, or maybe the system itself, he would be able to test out the teleportation feature. Once he'd finished his circuit, Elijah settled down next to the majestic tree at the center of the clearing, where he recast nature's bounty, pushing extra Ethera into it. The pathways of his soul flexed, expanding minutely with every pulse of energy only to return back to normal a moment later. However, they did seem a bit thicker than they had the day before. It might have been his imagination, or wishful thinking, perhaps, but his soul seemed a little sturdier. The pathways a little wider. It was as if the previous day's exertions had stretched them enough that some of the benefits remained. In some ways, it wasn't unlike his daily exercise. Repeated exertion seemed to be the key to channeling more Ethera through his soul, which he hoped would allow him to cast more powerful spells. Or maybe he was doing things completely wrong and he was on the verge of ruining his pathways. He had no way of knowing. But what he was doing felt right, which was enough to keep him going. Over the next 6 weeks, Elijah continued the rhythm of his existence. Even as the weather grew colder and more inhospitable, his days maintained the familiar cadence of improvement and the necessities of survival. From time to time, he'd go back to the cliff, where he continued to observe his neighbors. The town grew, with many of the buildings gaining an extra story or two. And whether it was imagination or not, the population seemed to increase as well. So, too, did their impact on the environment. Elijah seethed as he watched the forests retreat, but he had no idea what to do about it. Nor was he sure if he truly cared if they cleared a little bit of the woodland. There were plenty of trees out there, after all, but he felt what he felt, artificial or not, and he couldn't escape it. Toward the end of the 6th week, though, Elijah had a breakthrough that cut right through the monotony. It happened as he sat next to the tree at the center of his grove. The saplings had continued to grow, and they were on the verge of becoming proper trees. He could feel his spell teetering on the edge of activation. But that wasn't the source of his breakthrough. Instead, that distinction belonged to what he'd begun to refer to as his soul cultivation. The pathways of Elijah's soul had continued to thicken. The effect was only minute, but even a small change was cause for celebration because it allowed him to channel more Ethera into nature's bounty, which in turn caused the spell's radius to increase. In the beginning, it had only been about 10 feet wide, but now, the circle's diameter was at least 15 feet. Following the same pattern he always did, Elijah flexed the Ethera, pushing against the boundaries of his pathways. They stretched, but he felt that they could take more, so he continued to shove more Ethera through them. Then, suddenly, something snapped. Elijah gasped as the Ethera ran wild, tearing down the limits imposed by his pathways. In the space of a second, his entire soul began to degrade under the influence of the tidal wave of Ethera. Panicking, he tried to stem the flow, but his cultivation system had no interest in following his commands. Instead, Ethera flooded through his mind, dragged into his soul from his surroundings. Meanwhile, the energy in his core came in from the other side, and when the two energies met, they did so with explosive force. The world felt like it was ripping him in two. Elijah screamed, but it was useless. He could hardly think amidst the pain, much less find a solution to the problem. Over and over, those two opposing forces crashed against one another, sending agony arcing through Elijah's body, soul, and mind. It went on for a subjective eternity as the Ethera tormented him. Before, Elijah had considered the energy benign, but free from the confines of his cultivation system, it was an incredibly destructive force. Especially when the two different flavors, the wild Ethera and the energy from his core, clashed. But Elijah endured. He couldn't have said how. He didn't know why. He just clung to his life with as much fervor as could muster as he maintained the grip on his sanity. And slowly, the clashing energies transformed his pathways. But they didn't grow wider. In fact, they were destroyed completely, and the loose Ethera was freed to rampage through his body. But as the seconds turned to minutes and minutes turned to hours, the transformation took hold, and suddenly he crested the peak, and his body, or his soul, started to absorb the Ethera. At first, it only took a trickle, but soon, that trickle became a torrent. Then, at last, Elijah's soul drank the last of the Ethera that had been raging through his body, and he collapsed. When he did, a new notification appeared in his mind's eye. Congratulations! You have cultivated a neophyte soul. He only had a moment to study that notification and smile before unconsciousness overtook him.